and October 2015. A damp chill permeated the storage basement of the Ohio State Police headquarters in Columbus, where thousands of dusty case files had been sealed away for half a century. The beam of Lieutenant Marcy Quinn's flashlight swept across rows of aging steel shelves, illuminating the faded lettering on a thin file folder. Case #412, Cooper, Charlotte. She opened the lid of the box, releasing the musty odor of damp paper and old sealing wax. Inside was a small envelope containing a few discolored strands of hair and a handwritten note in a trembling script. Medical vehicle, Christ Hospital. Female suspect. Central, I need to verify the Cooper file, sealed in 1960, Marcy said into her radio. The sound echoed through the empty room, where a long-buried mystery was beginning to stir. What had started as a routine administrative review had become something entirely different, a development that would answer the questions that had haunted the town of Springdale for 55 years. A 3-year-old girl, Charlotte Cooper, had vanished from her family's yard on an October afternoon in 1960. A mother's screams had filled her kitchen. A green Chevrolet had appeared and disappeared without a trace. For half a century, the case had survived only in the hazy memories of a few elderly residents and an unresolved report. That changed when DNA from the envelope was analyzed. It led to a woman living in Indiana named Rose Flynn, who had never known that her childhood had begun with a kidnapping. For nearly 55 years, Charlotte's disappearance had consisted of unanswered questions, a missing child, a mother robbed of her daughter, and a town living under the shadow of silence. But the discovery in that old file did not merely close a single case. It was the first domino in a chain of events that would expose secrets spanning decades, long concealed within Ohio's medical system. For when investigators finally identified the perpetrator, it was not a drifter or a street criminal. It was a nurse, someone trusted by the community, who had cared for others' lives and lived among them for years while carrying an unimaginable secret. The Cooper case was more than the resolution of a single abduction. It was a testament to the power of forensic science, the persistence of investigators who refused to let time erase justice, and the belief that even the oldest case files could harbor the truth. It was also the story of a small community fractured by suspicion and silence. When Charlotte disappeared in 1960, accusations spread through Springdale like wildfire across dry prairie grass. Neighbors stopped speaking, and churches ceased ringing their bells in unison. But when the truth finally emerged, those fissures would erupt, not only in the past, but in the faith of an America that believed all its secrets had already been told. What made the Cooper case so haunting was that the answer had always been right in front of them. The perpetrator had been interviewed, had signed statements, and had left Ohio in silence with the child. For decades, that person had lived as an upstanding citizen, even donating to campaigns to find missing children. And when the truth came to light, no one in the town could believe that the justice they had awaited for so long wore such a familiar face. In 1960, Ohio embodied the typical post-war American landscape, peaceful, unhurried, and confident. The small town of Springdale, situated along the edge of Mill Creek and home to just a few thousand people, was a place where doors were left unlocked and everyone knew their neighbors' names. Life there was stable and simple, with no one imagining the possibility of crime or danger. The Cooper family lived in a white clapboard house at the end of Maple Street, an ordinary but happy home. William Cooper, 33, was a mechanic at the General Motors plant in Cincinnati. He was hard-working and taciturn, leaving home at dawn and returning at dusk. His wife, Helen, 28, taught at the town's elementary school. She was gentle, meticulous, and somewhat anxious. She spent most of her time caring for their 3-year-old daughter, Charlotte, a blonde girl with gray eyes, endlessly curious and prone to singing nursery school songs to herself. On ordinary days, Charlotte's laughter filled the yard, mingling with the sound of the morning radio and the hammering of William's tools in the garage. Neighbors stopped by to borrow an extension cord or drop off fresh apples. Everything was so familiar that no one could have imagined anything out of the ordinary happening in Springdale. In the weeks before the tragedy, Helen had noticed a light green Chevrolet that occasionally parked along the street near their home. The driver was a brown-haired woman in nurse's scrubs who would sit in the car for a few minutes before driving away. Helen felt a fleeting unease, but reassured herself that the woman was likely a Christ Hospital employee visiting an acquaintance. She mentioned it to William, who laughed it off and told her not to worry. "No one around here does anything bad." That morning, on a crisp October day under a clear sky, William left early for work, and Helen stayed home from school to prepare lesson plans. Charlotte took her doll out to the yard and sat by the fence, murmuring a nursery rhyme. From the kitchen window, Helen watched her daughter, then turned back to a pile of laundry. Moments later, the neighbor's dog barked furiously. The sound prolonged and unusual. When Helen looked up, she saw the green Chevrolet parked silently at the corner, sunlight glinting off its polished hood. She hesitated for a few seconds, intending to go outside, but the sound of boiling water on the stove pulled her back. When she returned, the yard was empty, Charlotte's doll lying tilted on the grass. Helen rushed into the street, looking around, but saw only the empty road and silent trees. She called her daughter's name, her voice lost in the wind. There were no footprints, no reply. Panic rising, she ran to the neighbors' houses, knocking and asking if anyone had seen Charlotte. All denied it. William was summoned back from the plant, and together they searched the property, combing every shrub and the small ditch behind the yard. Neighbors arrived with flashlights and spread out, calling the girl's name until their voices grew hoarse. As afternoon faded into evening, no trace was found. Helen stood in the middle of the yard, her clothes streaked with dirt, her hands trembling, her eyes fixed on the empty street where the car had been. She ran inside, grabbed the wall-mounted telephone receiver, and choked out through tears. "Springdale Police Department, my daughter is missing." At the other end of the line, the dispatcher paused briefly at the sound of her strangled sobs, then shifted to emergency protocol. A red signal light flashed on the dispatch board. Within 10 minutes, the first patrol car turned onto Maple Street, where neighbors had already gathered around the small clapboard house. Flashing police lights reflected off the windows and spilled across the yard, where the doll lay tilted amid trampled patches of grass. Two local officers, Robert Hayes and Jim Nichols, quickly secured the scene, documenting initial conditions and keeping the crowd away from the Cooper property. Helen stood on the porch steps, pale and gripping the doorframe. William, just returned from the plant with grease still on his clothes, looked dazed. They struggled to answer questions, emphasizing only that it all happened in less than a minute. The initial report was transmitted to headquarters with the highest priority, requesting county-level support. From the other end came a steady, low voice. "Hamilton County has received it. Lieutenant Frank Dillard is en route." 15 minutes later, the headlights of a gray Plymouth appeared at the end of the street. A middle-aged man in a long coat stepped out, moving with purposeful efficiency, the light catching the metal badge on his chest. He said nothing to Hayes beyond a curt instruction as he passed through the gate. "Preserve the scene." The atmosphere shifted as he entered the yard and surveyed the small house. Lieutenant Frank Dillard stood still for several seconds, his eyes scanning the low fence and the tire tracks imprinted in the damp gravel. He pulled out a notebook and issued clear orders. "Secure the area within a 100-meter radius. No one in or out without authorization." Dillard spoke rapidly, his voice low and clipped. Yellow crime scene tape was strung around the front yard, patrol cars activated floodlights, and forensic personnel unpacked their kits. He began his examination at the back door, where Hayes had marked the frame with white chalk. The hinges were intact, the doorknob unmarred. Beneath the wooden steps, Dillard crouched and used tweezers to collect a strand of light-colored hair caught on the door's edge, placing it in a sealed nylon envelope labeled M1. In the corner of the porch, he found a scrap of synthetic fabric, possibly from a sleeve or pocket, snagged on a wooden peg and designated it M2. Nichols reported that tire tracks had been photographed, 55 inches wide, Firestone 1958 tires. The type commonly fitted to Chevrolet Bel Airs. Dillard ordered additional Leica photographs to ensure clear lighting and angles. He noted, tracks lead south toward the main road. No evidence of turning around. Inside the house, the living room was orderly, with 2 glasses of water on the dining table, one still faintly warm. Charlotte's stuffed bear sat neatly beside the sofa. There were no overturned objects or unfamiliar handprints on surfaces. The girl's bedroom was preliminarily secured. Dillard only stepped to the doorway, glancing at the small bed covered with a rose-patterned blanket. Everything was too normal, which unsettled him. Returning to the kitchen, he found Helen seated with a coat draped over her shoulders, her hands tightly clasped. In a gentle tone, he asked about the moment she had looked away from the kitchen window. She said that around noon, after turning off the stove, she had turned back to find the yard empty. He inquired about recent days, any strangers, unusual calls, or mail. She replied that she had seen an unfamiliar woman in the green car several times, but had not thought much of it. William, standing nearby, confirmed that his wife had mentioned it, but had dismissed it as someone passing through. Dillard recorded everything in even handwriting, without interruption. He asked further about daily routines, where Charlotte typically played, whether she wandered far, and if anyone else supervised her. Helen said, the girl rarely left the yard, and never went onto the street alone. This convinced Dillard that the wandering child theory was baseless. Closing his notebook, he stepped back outside and paused at the fence. As shadows lengthened and police lights illuminated the gravel, he studied the fading tracks and told Nichols, no signs of forced entry, no tampering. This was not an accident. Someone came here knowing exactly what they wanted. That pronouncement silenced those around him. Dillard returned to his car and radioed Command Central, requesting an expanded search radius of 3 miles around the Cooper residence, the deployment of canine units, and aerial surveillance of the Mill Creek wooded area. As he signed off, he looked back at the house once more, the yellow tape swaying in the dusk, flashlights sweeping the yard, and catching the doll lying face up in the wet grass. The starting point of a disappearance he knew would not be resolved in a single day. Dusk had just fallen when orders for an expanded search were issued from Command Central. Within an hour, Maple Street and the surrounding neighborhood were cordoned off. Police vehicle lights bathing the low rooftops along the dirt road. The town fire department, local volunteer units, and more than 30 residents were mobilized and divided into 3 teams. One combing the Mill Creek woods to the west, another searching the riverbank to the south, and a third monitoring major road intersections. Lieutenant Dillard directed operations from a staging point near the Cooper fence. With a map spread across the hood of his car, search zones marked in red ink. Orders were concise: examine every foot of ground and overlook no foreign objects. As night fell, flashlights and flares illuminated the forest. Police dogs barked through the damp chill, their calls mingling with searchers shouting Charlotte's name into the darkness. One team followed trails along the creek where it wound through hickory trees. Another waded shallow river bends, looking for footprints, clothing, or anything related. The remaining groups stationed themselves at key road junctions. At midnight, a firefighter reported finding what appeared to be a child's shoe beside an oak tree half a mile from the Cooper house. Dillard arrived immediately and examined the small, dew-soaked canvas shoe under flashlight. Using gloved hands, he compared it to Helen's description. Charlotte wore size 6 red leather shoes. This shoe was brown and size 5 too small. He had it sealed and labeled Vi1, then directed teams to extend their sweep into the forest's edge. Footsteps, shouts, and the sound of water against the bank continued through the night. At 2 a.m., the riverbank team returned empty-handed, reporting only some animal-made slides in the sand. Dillard ordered a detailed check of the highway linking Springdale to Cincinnati, focusing on rest stops and gas stations within a 30-mile radius. At a fueling station along Route 23, an attendant reported that a green Chevrolet had stopped around noon, driven by a brown-haired woman in a light-colored coat who had filled up and headed south. The information was recorded, though no license plate was identified. The following morning, teams returned for a final sweep of the woods, using probes and detection equipment, but found nothing further. A light rain began to fall, turning the ground to mud and washing away old tracks, while a cold wind cut through the hickory trees, rendering the search futile. Dillard called in the teams and summarized, "No victim located, no definitive physical evidence." He looked at the exhausted faces, mud-streaked raincoats, strained eyes, Helen's among the crowd, and knew hope was fading, but every collected detail had to be pieced together. When the sun rose, the search was suspended, and teams returned to the Springdale police station to compile data. Lieutenant Frank Dillard sat in a small office, with a heavily marked area map on the desk, surrounded by sealed bags containing the collected hair sample, fabric scrap, soil, and the child's shoe from the woods. He reviewed all witness statements, cross-checked timelines, and drafted the first report for Hamilton County. The summary was concise and clear. Victim Charlotte Cooper, 3 years old, disappeared from her residence around noon on October 12, 1960. No signs of forced entry at the scene. Firestone 1958. Tire tracks, consistent with a green Chevrolet Bel Air, were found. An indirect witness described the driver as a brown-haired woman in light-colored clothing. Dillard's preliminary conclusion: this was most likely a planned abduction. The perpetrator was familiar with the area and the victim's family's routines. He underlined planned and added a notation: suspect vehicle may be associated with medical or service fleets. Hospital affiliations cannot be ruled out. After completing the 14-page report, Dillard sent a formal request for cooperation to the Cincinnati Police Department, and specifically, Christ Hospital's Vehicle Management Office, which operated a fleet of similarly styled green Chevrolet sedans with institutional plates. The request sought a list of employees assigned to vehicles on October 12, along with records of female drivers employed there. The file was stamped urgent and dispatched that morning. Hours later, an internal briefing was held in the Hamilton County Command Room. Dillard presented a summary of the situation, displaying area maps and scene photographs. A senior officer asked, "Is there direct evidence of abduction?" Dillard replied succinctly, "No. But all indicators point in that direction." The meeting concluded with instructions from the watch commander: withhold information from the press. Do not confirm any hypothesis until corroborating witnesses or physical evidence is obtained. Avoid public panic. This order restricted public disclosures. Dillard understood the reasoning. A case involving a child in a hospital, if leaked prematurely, would cause an uproar. Returning to his desk, he added an appendix. Detailed examination of routes between Springdale and Cincinnati is required. Monitor gas stations, overpasses, and rest areas, with the possibility that the suspect used Route 23 to exit the town. Throughout the day, he repeatedly contacted the hospital's vehicle administration office, but received only vague assurances from clerical staff. The request has been noted, the responsible party is out, and will follow up. By evening, no formal response had arrived. Dillard sat before the growing stack of files, flipping through black and white scene photographs, and pausing at an enlarged image of the green car described by witnesses. Outside, a steady drizzle fell, the yellow crime scene tape in front of the Cooper house beginning to fade. In the report, he added a final line: Christ Hospital, requested response not yet received. Pursuit to continue. File to be held confidential. 3 days after the report was submitted, Charlotte Cooper's disappearance began appearing on the front pages of local newspapers. Initial coverage was brief, quoting the police bulletin, "Child missing in Springdale, investigation underway." But overnight, the story escalated. The Cincinnati Enquirer ran a prominent article headlined, "Calm Mother Amid Tragedy, What is Being Hidden?" A photograph of Helen leaving the scene, pale-faced and blank-eyed, was featured on the front page, accompanied by vague captions suggesting an unusual composure. Tabloid-style papers quickly pursued sensational angles: "Silent Teacher Mother, strange behavior, and conflicts within the Cooper family. No one outside the police had suggested as much, but the stories pieced together disjointed neighbor comments and baseless speculation. Dillard read the coverage in his office and slammed the paper down, demanding who leaked the preliminary file. No one answered. When he pressed superiors, he received only prolonged silence. That afternoon, a swarm of reporters gathered outside the Cooper house, equipped with cameras and microphones, setting up camp on the sidewalk. They photographed windows, interviewed neighbors, and spun narratives about a detached mother. Helen retreated to a relative's home to escape the lenses. William, exhausted and furious, tried without success to hold them back. Public sentiment began shifting from sympathy to suspicion. Local police faced immense pressure, with hotlines flooded by calls demanding clarification of the parents' role. In a closed meeting, department leadership instructed the investigative team to consider the possibility of an internal family factor. Dillard objected immediately. There is no evidence for that. All physical traces lead away from this house. Some younger officers nodded in agreement, but his direct superior, Captain Givens, slammed his hand on the table and said coldly, "The public wants answers, and they need a clear direction." Dillard stiffened, recognizing that media pressure was beginning to steer the investigation. The following day, an internal subpoena was issued, requiring Helen and William Cooper to report to the station to assist in clarifying details related to the case. Dillard was instructed to temporarily relinquish the file to a psychological profiling unit. He argued that interrogating the parents at this stage would only convince the public of their guilt, but his objection was overruled. Captain Givens emphasized, "This is direction from above. You should focus on the technical aspects." As Dillard left the room, he saw a colleague folding a fresh newspaper bearing the bold headline, "Police summon Charlotte Cooper's parents for questioning, case breakthrough." Public reaction exploded. Rumors spread via evening radio broadcasts, and residents flooded police lines demanding investigative results. In that stifling atmosphere, Dillard received an internal reprimand stating that he had shown signs of exceeding his authority and making unauthorized statements. He signed the memorandum without a word. That night, alone in the small office under the glow of a desk lamp, Dillard stared at a photograph of Charlotte with her parents, the girl's eyes looking directly and innocently into the camera. He knew the investigation was veering off course, and the press had unwittingly transformed a family of victims into the primary objects of statewide suspicion. On Monday morning, exactly 3 days after the press had escalated the matter, Helen and William received a summons from the Springdale Police Department. The notice was printed on a standard, impersonal administrative form, with the clear heading, "Request for assistance in clarifying details of the Charlotte Cooper case." They arrived at the station at 8 o'clock, in damp, misty weather, and neither spoke a word during the drive. Helen wore a thin coat and clutched a small Bible tightly in her hands, while William struggled to maintain composure, his face rigid with tension. The interrogation room was small, with harsh fluorescent lights glaring off gray walls. 2 investigators, Lieutenant Marlowe and Officer Peters, began with questions about the morning of the disappearance, who had last seen Charlotte, the precise time, whether the doors had been locked, and which neighbors had been home. Helen tried to answer each question, her voice trembling, her eyes repeatedly dropping to the floor. William interjected, stating that he had left the house at 7 a.m. and gone to the General Motors plant, where colleagues could verify his presence. Peters requested the names of those colleagues. Dillard, observing from the one-way mirror, could clearly see the strain on both their faces. Meanwhile, Marlowe pressed them about their marital relationship, any conflicts, threats against the family, financial problems, or debts. William reacted sharply, slamming his hand on the table and insisting that they were victims, not criminals. The interrogation lasted 4 hours, after which they were required to sign a detailed statement outlining the movements of every family member on October 12th. Subsequently, the police verified their statements by telephone. The plant confirmed William had been at work from 7:15 a.m. until 4 p.m. without leaving his station, and the surrounding neighbors corroborated that Helen had been home that morning, with no one reporting any arguments or unusual activity. Despite all elements aligning, the investigative unit remained unsatisfied. An internal report noted, "No signs of violence, but continued observation of the victim's mother's behavior is required." Abnormal emotional presentation. The phrase abnormal emotional presentation was added to the summary and served as the basis for reclassifying the case as family under suspicion. Dillard read this line in the report forwarded to his office, gripping his pen tightly. He had previously argued in a meeting that there was no evidence of misconduct by the parents, but his position was dismissed in favor of maintaining objectivity. That afternoon, Captain Givens summoned him to his office and said bluntly, "You are being removed from direct responsibility for the Cooper case. The internal committee wants someone else to handle the family psychological aspects. You will hand over the original files and reports." Dillard stood silently for a few seconds, then nodded, gathered the documents, and left without a word. In the quiet hallway outside, neon lights reflected off the tiled floor. He paused at the bulletin board, where that morning's newspaper bore the bold headline, "Police probe deeper into Cooper family life, new questions about the mother." Dillard looked at Helen's photograph on the page, her face weary, her eyes dry and tearless, then turned away. He understood that the investigation had veered from its original focus, and now, rather than searching for the child, everyone was seeking to prove something that no evidence could substantiate. 2 weeks after the interrogation, the official search was formally concluded. On Monday morning, the Hamilton County Police Department issued a brief statement to the press. After 14 days of intensive effort, no new developments have been found in the disappearance of Charlotte Cooper. The investigation has not yet yielded definitive results. The terse language made no mention of suspects or lines of inquiry. The yellow ribbons around the Cooper home were quietly removed, leaving only faint gravel marks where patrol cars had parked. Neighbors ceased gathering, and reporters departed, leaving only a few lines in the papers framing the case as another Midwestern mystery. Helen, exhausted after many sleepless nights, was taken to a local hospital in a state of physical collapse and temporary loss of speech. She sat silently in her hospital bed, her eyes vacant, unresponsive to the doctor's questions. William, after signing a series of administrative forms, returned to the empty house, where Charlotte's toys still lay on the table. He sat for hours, staring at the vacant yard where his daughter had once played, rising only as darkness fell to silently lock her bedroom door. Outside, autumn had arrived, with maple leaves piling thick on the eaves, but within the house, no sound remained except the slow ticking of the clock. At the police station, a brief internal meeting was held. Captain Givens announced that the Cooper case was being placed in suspended status pending new evidence. Frank Dillard sat quietly in the corner, listening without comment. He knew he had been effectively sidelined. An administrative transfer to the Records Division was assigned to him concurrently with the case's closure. No one explicitly said he had been removed from the investigation, but the transfer order was clear evidence of it. That afternoon, Dillard cleared out his desk. In his filing cabinet, he retained a personal copy of his notes and a photograph of Charlotte taken at that year's spring festival, a beaming little girl holding a balloon. He folded the photo, slipped it into his shirt pocket, locked the drawer, and left the room. In the hallway, the fluorescent lights hummed steadily, and the sound of typewriters continued uninterrupted, as if nothing had happened. At the end of the corridor, the bulletin board now displayed an official notice: Cooper case, no progress, investigation suspended. Dillard paused to read every word, then walked out. Outside, a light rain was falling, and the streets of Springdale returned to normal, save for the white frame house at the end of Maple Street, which remained locked, its windows dust-covered and a faded police notice taped inside. Time passed, and the disappearance of Charlotte Cooper gradually receded from the collective memory of Springdale. By 1965, The police notice once taped to the Cooper house's window had yellowed, its printing nearly faded, with only the faint words, "No trespassing, secured scene," still legible. Few people spoke any longer of the 3-year-old girl who had vanished. Those who had participated in the search had returned to their lives. New neighbors had moved in unaware of the story, and the old newspaper accounts of the case lay forgotten in the town library, wedged between articles on taxes and local elections. The white frame house stood abandoned for years before being sold at a discount to a young couple, who renovated it completely, repainting the walls, replacing the windows, and erasing nearly all traces of the past. The Cooper family disintegrated without any formal announcement. After her release from the hospital, Helen moved in with her sister in Cleveland, her health frail. William visited occasionally, but those visits grew increasingly infrequent. They did not divorce, but simply drifted apart, as if neither had the strength to hold on to what had been lost. Helen gave up teaching and worked part-time as a church librarian, living a withdrawn life and avoiding all questions about the case. In 1972, she was hospitalized again for heart disease and died in her sleep in the early winter of 1974, at the age of 42. Her gravestone in St. Mary's Cemetery bore the simple inscription, "Helen Cooper, Mother Who Waited." William did not attend the funeral. He moved alone to a northern suburb, worked as a machinist until the plant closed, and then left Ohio without leaving a forwarding address. A few old friends said he occasionally sent letters containing only a brief message, "I am still searching." Those letters were addressed to no one in particular, and enclosed only a small photograph of Charlotte. The case file rested untouched in the Hamilton County Archives, among hundreds of others. In 1980, when Lieutenant Frank Dillard submitted his retirement papers, he made a final visit to the office to transfer documents. The Cooper file remained in the third drawer, covered in dust, its cover frayed at the edges. Dillard opened it, leafing through the aged papers, the black and white photographs of fences and tire tracks, and his own handwritten note from 30 years earlier. Medical vehicle needs verification. No one had ever followed up on that detail. He carefully removed his original copy of the notes, folded them, placed them in a separate envelope, and took them home. After retiring, Dillard lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Cincinnati, tending a few potted plants, and spending much of his time reading newspapers and keeping a journal. He maintained no contact with former colleagues and rarely discussed the Cooper case, but the paper bearing the words medical vehicle remained intact in his desk drawer, next to a fountain pen and a photograph of a smiling blonde girl. Each October 12th, he would take it out, wipe it with a cloth, study it at length, and put it away. In 1987, upon learning that William Cooper had died in a cheap rented room in Dayton, Dillard attended the sparsely attended funeral and stood at a distance, saying nothing. He placed a single white chrysanthemum on the grave. Autumn winds blew through the cemetery, carrying the scent of damp earth and the rustle of dry leaves. It seemed as though everything had finally concluded, an old case, 2 deceased principals, stacks of files no longer read by anyone. But in the drawer of the retired detective remained a thin sheaf of papers, its corners curled, bearing a steady, firm hand. Green Chevrolet, medical vehicle, owner unverified. Nearly 3 decades later, the Cooper case, long presumed erased from the memory of Ohio, resurfaced when a project to digitize decades-old records was undertaken at the State Criminal Archives Center in Columbus. In 2015, state authorities approved a plan to inventory and scan all unresolved or closed files more than 50 years old, including thousands of child disappearance cases from the 1950s through 1970s. The archives were housed in a windowless gray concrete building, a converted police warehouse, where metal shelves groaned under the weight of dust-covered brown cardboard boxes stacked high, their labels peeling and handwritten notations faded. 32-year-old Lieutenant Marcy Quinn was assigned to oversee a team reviewing the files. A former civilian investigator known for her meticulousness and patience, She had a penchant for seeking answers in cases long considered hopeless. The team's task was to open each box, scan the documents, assign identification codes, and note the status of any physical evidence. One August morning, while examining a batch labeled 1950-1965, Hamilton County, Marcy pulled out a thin box with an aged but intact red wax seal. The handwritten paper label read, Case #412, Cooper, Charlotte, Missing Child, 1960. The words caused her to pause. The contents were unusually well organized: typed reports, scene logs, several black and white photographs, and two small sealed brown envelopes, marked M1 and M2. An attached document bore a faint signature, Lieutenant Frank Dillard. In a sterile examination room, Marcy carefully opened the first envelope and found a light-colored strand of hair, about 3 inches long, coiled within wax paper. The second contained a fragment of faded synthetic fabric with ragged edges. Both items retained their original 1960 evidence seals and had never been reanalyzed. The accompanying documentation provided a brief scene summary: Firestone 1958 tire impressions, private residence, no signs of forced entry. At the end, in handwriting distinct from the typed text, evidently Dillard's, and written in green ink, was the note, Medical vehicle, needs verification. The brief phrase caught Marcy's attention. Following procedure, she entered the case data into the digital system, scanned every page, and flagged it for priority biological evidence testing. However, a review of records showed the Cooper file had never been sent to any forensic laboratory in over half a century. The existence of an untested hair sample was exceptionally rare. Marcy reported it to her supervisor, who instructed her to scan and archive it without further testing. Sitting before her computer screen, staring at the words Case Closed, 1960, she felt the pull of professional instinct. That afternoon, after the team had left, she returned to the archives with fresh evidence bags. She reopened the Cooper box, photographed its entire contents, then carefully transferred the 2 evidence envelopes into standard modern packaging and applied electronic labels. In the tracking log, she noted, preserved samples, intact condition. Recommend transfer to Ohio State Forensic Laboratory for DNA analysis. Knowing this exceeded her authority, she proceeded anyway, aware that bureaucratic procedures sometimes buried potential truths. Before leaving, she photographed Charlotte's image from the file, a blonde child with gray eyes and an innocent smile. An odd feeling came over her, as if she were seeing a familiar face she had never met. The next day, Marcy personally delivered the sealed envelope containing the samples to the State Forensic Center in Worthington. The receiving analyst, Dr. David Hale, a forensic geneticist, examined the labels, verified the intact seals, and documented their receipt. When he asked the reason for re-examination, she replied simply, "I need to ensure this case was fully investigated." Hale agreed to process the samples using next-generation full genome sequencing, a technique capable of recovering genetic material from decades-old specimens. As she left the laboratory, Marcy paused to look through the glass. Under the white lights, the 2 small evidence envelopes lay on a steel tray, unassuming and silent, but to her, they represented a door reopening in an archive dormant for more than half a century. That afternoon, she added a final note to the digital system: sample M1, hair, M2, fabric, transferred to Ohio State Forensic Laboratory. August 14, 2015. Responsible party, Lieutenant Marcy Quinn. As she saved the entry, the wall clock struck 5, and the archive's lights dimmed. In the fading glow of sunset, Marcy stood for a moment amid the rows of shelves, feeling the cool air circulate. At the top of the box, the old label remained legible: Cooper, Charlotte, Missing Child. She placed her hand lightly on the lid, as if making a silent promise that this forgotten case would be reconsidered, however small a fragment it might be among thousands of names obscured by time. 3 weeks after Marcy transferred the samples to Worthington, the Ohio State Forensic Laboratory began extracting DNA from the Cooper case evidence. Hale and his technicians processed the hair sample using next-generation sequencing technology, which can analyze biological material preserved for decades. Working in a sealed, temperature-controlled room with white light reflecting off stainless steel surfaces, they examined the thin, nearly transparent pale blonde strand under a microscope. Though the outer cuticle was gone, sufficient mitochondrial DNA remained in the root to reconstruct a genetic profile. Hale documented each step: extraction, amplification, and sequencing. After 48 hours, the sequencer produced a string of thousands of base pairs. Automated software compared the data against the state's population database and the National CODIS repository. The initial result indicated a partial match with the profile of a living individual, a female residing in Indiana, registered as Rose Flynn, born in 1957, with her reference sample entered into the system in 2012 through a community health program. Marcy received the electronic notification at 9 a.m. on September 7th. She read and reread the message: partial match found, 62% similarity, subject, Flynn, Rose. The percentage was insufficient for definitive kinship, but unusually high for random coincidence. Following protocol, the forensic laboratory forwarded a preliminary report with genetic sequence alignments to the requesting agency. Marcy printed the entire package and spread it across her desk. The single surviving strand of hair from the Cooper case had yielded the name of a middle-aged woman living in a neighboring state. The question was inescapable: why would the genetic profile of Rose Flynn, born in 1957, partially match that of a 3-year-old abducted in 1960? Marcy contacted Dr. Hale to rule out contamination or error. He confirmed the process had been rigorously controlled. Any discrepancy would reflect distant familial relatedness, not random overlap, he said. Marcy sat silently before the screen, studying the intersecting blue and red bands of the DNA electropherograms, where matching base pairs aligned. Doubt mingled with excitement. Reviewing the original file, she noted the timeline. If Charlotte had disappeared in 1960, she would now be approximately 58 years old, the same age as Rose Flynn. The coincidence quickened her pulse. She drafted an internal memorandum: recommend reopening case #412, based on DNA evidence. Partial match with subject Rose Flynn. Verification of identity and biological background required. The memorandum was submitted through the case management system to State Command. The following day, the project director called her, his tone cautious. You want to reopen a case closed for 55 years based on a partial match? Marcy replied. It is more than a partial match. This mitochondrial sequence is sufficient to establish maternal lineage linkage. That means Rose Flynn is either the victim or directly maternally related to her. After a pause, the man said quietly, if you accept administrative responsibility, I will approve it. She agreed without hesitation. That evening, working alone in her office, Marcy opened the digitized photograph of Charlotte. Small face, lightly curled blonde hair, bright gray eyes, and placed it beside a reference image of Rose Flynn extracted from the Indiana population database. A woman with pale blonde hair, direct gaze, high nose bridge, and a slight upward curve to the mouth. Despite the half-century gap, an undeniable similarity existed in the line of the cheekbones, the shape of the jaw, and the cast of the eyes. She added a final line to her proposal. The possibility that victim Charlotte Cooper is alive requires identity verification. The next day, she received state-level authorization to initiate preliminary investigation for living person DNA comparison in Indiana, accompanied by a directive to form an interstate task force between Ohio and Indiana. As she printed the authorization, Marcy paused. At the bottom of the page, the electronic signature of the approving official stood beside a red seal. She closed the file, placing it in a folder labeled Cooper Case, and left her office. In her mind echoed the numbers: 1960, disappearance, 2015, DNA match. 55 years obscured by time could now be pierced by a single carefully preserved strand of hair. For Marcy, It was more than data. It was a reminder that justice sometimes required only one person willing to examine what everyone else had ceased to pursue. 3 days after receiving authorization for verification, Marcy began compiling a complete personal profile on Rose Flynn from the Indiana State Population Database. The record showed a female, born March 12, 1957, age 58, residing in Fort Wayne. Current occupation, retired nurse, with 30 years of service at St. Joseph Hospital. Marital status, never married, no children, living alone in a small frame house on the northern outskirts of the city. Under family information, only one name appeared, Margaret Flynn, foster mother, deceased 2010. Marcy printed the profile, underlining foster mother, and proceeded to the vital records file. Rose's birth certificate had been issued in Kentucky in 1963. 6 years after the stated date of birth. She frowned. Delayed birth certificates could be issued for lost original records, but the medical certification section was blank. The certifying party was listed only as a handwritten signature, Dr. A. Wells, obstetrician, without a license number. A search of Kentucky medical registries yielded no physician by that name practicing between 1960 and 1970. Nor did any hospital bear the faint embossed seal on the document. These discrepancies formed a chain of inconsistencies. Marcy documented them in a case note. Birth certificate appears fraudulent. Origin requires verification. To investigate, she contacted the Kentucky Bureau of Vital Statistics. After nearly 10 minutes, the clerk responded with surprise, "There is no original birth record matching that certificate number in our archival holdings." The document may have been manually created outside the state registration system. Marcy requested written confirmation and submitted a formal inquiry to the Fort Wayne Administrative Office for Rose's residency records. 3 days later, the response indicated that Rose Flynn had first registered as a resident of Indiana in 1972, at age 15, accompanied by a high school enrollment certification signed by Margaret Flynn as her legal guardian. Local records further confirmed that Margaret had worked as a labor and delivery nurse at Christ Hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio, less than 40 miles from Springdale. The connection halted Marcy in her tracks. Christ Hospital was the institution referenced in Lieutenant Dillard's 1960 report in connection with a green Chevrolet. Further archival research placed Margaret Flynn on the hospital's staff roster as a labor and delivery nurse from 1958 to 1960, with her employment terminating in October 1960, the precise month of Charlotte Cooper's disappearance. Marcy printed all the documents and marked each point of convergence in red ink. A timeline emerged. A Cincinnati nurse resigns in 1960. 6 years later, she appears in Kentucky with a young girl bearing the Flynn surname and a delayed birth certificate by 1972. They are established in Indiana. Marcy traced the route on a map, Springdale to Cincinnati, south to Kentucky, then north to Fort Wayne, forming a closed triangle within a few hundred miles. None of the links appeared coincidental, yet all were merely administrative in nature. Field verification was required to advance the investigation. Marcy contacted the Fort Wayne Police Department, outlining the interstate cold case involving a 1960 child abduction and requesting assistance in compiling background information on Rose Flynn. The department agreed to cooperate and assigned local investigator, Lieutenant Thomas Reeve. In their initial video call, Reeve skimmed the documents and remarked, "I know Mrs. Flynn. People around here call her Nurse Rose. She keeps to herself, is polite. No one would associate her with anything out of the ordinary." Marcy requested access to Rose's medical and educational records for biological comparison. The following day, she received copies of Rose's elementary school file, showing enrollment at St. Mary's Elementary in Kentucky, beginning in 1966, with no information on biological parents, only the notation "no contact with birth family." Subsequent high school records listed an address matching Margaret Flynn's residence. There was no data predating 1963. All traces before that point were entirely absent, as if the woman's life had begun with the delayed birth certificate. Marcy placed a photograph of 3-year-old Charlotte alongside a current image of Rose, and pinned them to an investigative board. Across the decades, undeniable similarities persisted: the structure of the cheekbones, the contour of the jaw, the angle of the gaze. She added a summary line: working hypothesis, Rose Flynn may be the Cooper victim, abducted in 1960. DNA reference sample from living subject required for identity confirmation. Having completed the memorandum, Marcy composed an internal email to the Ohio State Forensic Director, attaching the compiled data and formally requesting interstate coordination for direct verification. Before sending it, she reviewed the subject line: identity verification, Rose Flynn and Cooper case #412. Her hand paused for a second, then clicked send. The screen went dark, leaving only the faint hum of the cooling fan in the brightly lit room. On the display, the woman's name remained starkly visible: Rose Flynn, age 58, occupation, nurse. A dry entry that held the potential to redefine the meaning of a disappearance buried for half a century. 1 week after submitting the federal coordination request, Marcy drove to Fort Wayne with investigator Thomas Reeve to meet Rose Flynn in person. On a foggy September morning, the road leading to the northern suburbs was covered with fallen leaves, and the maple trees had turned a deep red. Rose's house sat at the end of a quiet street, with an old shingled roof, a wooden porch adorned with dried flower baskets, and a small sign reading "Nurse on duty, retired." When Marcy knocked, the woman who answered was thin, with silver blonde hair, fine lines at the corners of her eyes, and hands that still bore the precise movements of a longtime nurse. Rose invited them inside, her voice soft but guarded. Marcy introduced herself, presented her credentials, and stated the purpose. "We are reviewing an old case that may be connected to you. I need your cooperation to verify certain information." Rose frowned slightly, then offered a weary smile. "If I can help, I will." The small living room was covered with old photographs on the walls. Rose in her nurse's uniform, Rose with colleagues, and one photo with an elderly woman whom Marcy presumed to be Margaret Flynn. When asked about her adoptive mother, Rose said she had died in 2010, very peacefully in her sleep. When Marcy inquired further about her childhood, Rose paused for several seconds, as if searching her memory. "I don't remember much. We lived in Kentucky when I was very young, then moved here. Mother never spoke of my father. I only know she adopted me when I was very small." Marcy turned on her recorder and requested permission to record the conversation. Rose nodded. When Marcy mentioned the possible need for a biological sample to verify genetic data, Rose appeared surprised but did not object. "You mentioned something that happened in Ohio? I've never been there. At least not that I remember." She nodded as Marcy briefly explained that an old missing persons case involved a DNA profile matching her own. Rose sat silently, her hands clasped together. "Sometimes I dream of being somewhere else, in a wooden house, with fields, with a different woman who was not my mother," she said quietly. Marcy asked, "Do you remember that woman's face?" Rose shook her head. "Only the smell of laundry starch and a singing voice, probably lulling me to sleep." The statement sent a chill through Marcy. She opened her notebook and recorded the words verbatim. Those vague details, though slight, aligned with her intuition about a connection between the names Charlotte Cooper and Rose Flynn. When the conversation concluded, Marcy explained the process for drawing a blood sample to compare DNA profiles. Rose signed the consent form, her hand trembling slightly. The elderly nurse rolled up her sleeve, revealing a small scar on her left forearm. "A childhood accident," she said, though she could not recall the details. Marcy drew 2 tubes of blood using a sterile needle, sealed them with individually numbered, electronic tamper-evident tags, and labeled them Subject RF. Fort Wayne, Indiana. As the tubes were placed in a cold box, Rose watched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "You said I might be connected to someone in Ohio? Could it be a relative?" Marcy replied, "We cannot say for certain, but this test may help clarify that." Rose gave a faint smile. "I've lived my whole life with unanswered questions. If this can tell me where I came from, I'm willing." After completing the formalities, Marcy requested permission to examine the house. On a table was a small wooden box containing Margaret Flynn's papers, a nursing diploma, several black and white photographs, and a 1960 letter of separation from Christ Hospital in Cincinnati. When asked, Rose explained, "I found it in Mother's dresser after she died. I think it was work memorabilia." Marcy photographed the documents and noted in her log, documents confirming Margaret Flynn's association with Christ Hospital, consistent with 1960 data. Before leaving, Marcy asked one final time, "Did your adoptive mother ever mention Ohio or the name Cooper?" Rose thought for a moment and shook her head. "No, but I remember her saying, 'Every child ends up where it belongs.' I never understood what she meant." That statement lingered in Marcy's mind for the entire drive back. As they left Fort Wayne, the sky had turned to the pale orange of dusk, and the wind rustled through the dry cornfields. She opened her phone and entered supplemental notes. Subject cooperative, childhood memories fragmented, description of a different woman, details to be cross-referenced with 1960 witness statements. Blood sample collected. Code RF0915, sent to Ohio State Forensics Laboratory for comparison with Cooper sample. Expected results in 14 days. She closed the device, leaned back in her seat, and the image of the silver-haired woman, with her gentle eyes and faint smile, remained vivid in her mind. There was something about this woman that made Marcy feel both a sense of closeness and unease, as if the gaps in the case file were beginning to connect, silently forming an invisible thread leading back to a past that neither could yet name. 14 days after Rose Flynn's blood sample was submitted, the Ohio State Forensics Laboratory completed the DNA comparison. The results report was sent directly to the Special Investigations Office, with the final line printed in bold: match rate 99.8%, paternal lineage confirmed. Marcy read the figure repeatedly, her eyes fixed on the name of the individual matched: William Cooper, 86, residing in a Columbus nursing home. For a brief moment, all surrounding sounds receded, leaving only the pounding of her heartbeat. She stood motionless in front of the computer screen, a mixture of weight and astonishment settling over her, then sat down and reopened every data file. The mitochondrial DNA sequence matched the paternal lineage completely, a result that could not be coincidental. Charlotte Cooper, the child abducted in 1960, and Rose Flynn, the 58-year-old woman in Indiana, were the same person. She immediately called Dr. Hale to independently verify the results. He replied with certainty, "There is no doubt. This is a direct father-daughter biological relationship. A 99.8% match equates to virtual certainty, given the age of the original sample." Marcy leaned back in her chair as sunlight fell across the faded paper file, labeled Case Hash 412, Cooper, Charlotte. What had once been speculation was now undeniable fact. She opened the working log and typed succinctly, "DNA test results confirm that Rose Flynn is Charlotte Cooper. Recommend reopening missing persons file hash 412, classification, victim confirmed alive." She then called her supervisor, her voice steady but unable to conceal her excitement. "We have an unequivocal match. The Cooper case needs to be reopened immediately." An emergency meeting was convened that afternoon at State Police Headquarters. Representatives from forensics, cold case, and administrative units were present. Marcy presented a summary of the entire process, from the discovery of the preserved sample in storage to the genetic comparison with population databases, concluding with a graphic display of the near-perfect genetic match. When the 99.8% figure appeared on the screen, the room fell silent for several seconds before one voice broke through. "If this is accurate, we have just located a missing person after half a century." The director of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation nodded and authorized reopening. "Reopen file hash 412, Cooper, Charlotte. Transfer the case to the Federal Coordinated Cold Case Unit." The authorization order, bearing a red official seal, was issued that evening. The database updated to reflect the new status: case reopened. Active investigation. In the electronic file, The name Rose Flynn was automatically linked to Charlotte Cooper's original record, displaying side by side the portrait of a 3-year-old girl from 1960 and that of the 58-year-old woman. Marcy studied them, noting the clear similarities in the eyes and the curve of the mouth. The strangeness and emotional weight of the moment required her to sit still for a time to compose herself. The following morning, an internal bulletin from the state police announced Ohio Cold Case Unit mobilized to coordinate with the Indiana investigative team on the Cooper-Flynn matter. Objective: determine criminal actions related to the 1960 child abduction. Marcy was appointed lead coordinator. The personnel roster included representatives from forensics, cold case specialists, identification experts, and historical scene examination technicians. The team's first meeting took place at the Columbus Operations Center. Maps of the Springdale area were spread on the table, alongside medical records, birth certificates, and the original statement from Lieutenant Frank Dillard. When his name was mentioned, an older investigator remarked quietly, "Dillard was reassigned after opposing the investigation's focus on the family. He seems to have been the only one who believed the girl was abducted." Marcy paused, recalling the faded signature in the file, Lieutenant F. Dillard. The solitary effort of that long-ago officer had finally been proven correct. She entered into the record, "Origin of discovery, indirectly derived from Lieutenant Dillard's 1960 report, item medical vehicle, needs verification." Following the meeting, the Cold Case Unit began collecting all relevant documents from Hamilton County and Christ Hospital. Boxes of old files were transported to Columbus and labeled for priority re-examination. Concurrently, the State Attorney General's office classified the case as one of the longest-standing disappearances in history, in which the subject had been confirmed alive. Marcy returned to her office at the end of the day and saw the blinking light on her phone, a new message from the St. John's Nursing Home in Columbus. William Cooper, age 86, has been informed of the DNA results and requests to meet the lead investigator. She read the message, her hand trembling slightly. Outside, darkness had fallen, and rain tapped steadily against the glass roof. She picked up the file, glanced at the temporary label reading Charlotte Cooper, found alive, and took a deep breath before closing the binder. After 55 years, a case once marked unresolved had been revived by a single strand of hair, a father still living, and a woman who had spent her life unaware of her true identity. The state of Ohio formally authorized the reopening of the Cooper file on September 27, 2015. On the same day, the personnel roster concluded with a clear directive: Cold Case Unit, statewide operations, lead investigator, Lieutenant Marcy Quinn. Immediately after the Cooper file was reopened, the Cold Case Unit began its first major task, a comprehensive review of all records related to Christ Hospital in Cincinnati, from 1958 to 1961. Marcy led the administrative forensic subgroup, focusing on personnel files and registered vehicle lists. On Monday morning, she and 2 investigators arrived at the hospital's central archives, where paper records were stored in dust-covered metal boxes. An archivist unlocked the storage area, where fluorescent lights reflected off rows of cabinets labeled by year and department: surgery, pediatrics, maternity, administration. Marcy selected the section labeled Maternity, 1958, 1961, pulled out the drawer, and began examining files, noting names, employment dates, and contract statuses. About an hour later, one name caused her to stop: Margaret E. Flynn, registered nurse, Department of Obstetrics. The file indicated she began work in May 1958 and resigned in October 1960. Reason given as change of residence, voluntary separation. That timing drew her attention, coinciding with the month and year of Charlotte Cooper's disappearance. She photocopied the entire file and photographed its pages. The personal history listed a prior Cincinnati address and marital status: widowed, no children. An internal medical note stated, "Requested sick leave in September 1960, did not return to work." Marcy recorded every detail, marking key items in red ink. She also located a list of hospital vehicles used for staff transport and medical errands. The third entry read, Chevrolet Bel Air, light green, license plate, 023X57, assigned to supply department, temporarily used by Nurse Flynn. Marcy paused, recognizing that this confirmed the final link in Dillard's 1960 report. Supplemental records included a vehicle maintenance request dated October 10, 1960. 2 days before the abduction, the maintenance file lacked a completion signature and bore a handwritten note. Vehicle not returned, reported missing October 13. Every detail matched the timeline and description in the Cooper file. Marcy took a deep breath and noted in her log, Margaret Flynn, primary suspect. Possessed vehicle matching description, resigned at time of incident. She contacted hospital administration to verify Margaret's residence after resignation, but the archivist reported that personnel address records had been destroyed in the 1970s. However, an accompanying folder contained a handwritten letter from Margaret to the department head, thanking him for the years of service at Christ Hospital and stating she would relocate to Kentucky to care for a family member. No specific address was provided. Marcy collected photocopies of all documents, placed them in a temporary file labeled Flynn, primary suspect, and upon returning to Columbus, presented her findings to the cold case unit. In the briefing, she outlined the chain of connections: a nurse at Christ Hospital, who used a hospital-owned green Chevrolet, resigned in October 1960, without explanation, and at the same time the vehicle was reported missing. Dillard had annotated medical vehicle needs verification in his original report. After 55 years, all the elements aligned precisely. Other investigators cross-checked vehicle records with the State Department of Motor Vehicles and confirmed that license plate 023X57 was never reissued. The vehicle was listed as missing in a 1961 administrative report. The evidence surrounding the green Chevrolet became the first key link between the hospital and the Cooper case. Marcy proposed examining payroll and Social Security records to determine whether Margaret Flynn had relocated to another state. 3 days later, Social Security Administration records showed that Margaret ceased paying taxes and receiving wages after late 1960, with her records reappearing in Kentucky in April 1961. The same location where Rose's delayed birth registration occurred. Marcy compiled a comprehensive timeline, 1958. Margaret begins employment at Christ Hospital, October 1960. Resigns and reports the green Chevrolet missing, April 1961, appears in Kentucky with a 6-year-old child, registering the birth of Rose Flynn. When the completed timeline was presented, the room fell silent. A veteran investigator murmured, "She vanished at the same time as the child." Marcy nodded and entered into the preliminary conclusions. Identified suspect, Margaret Flynn, female nurse, age 30 in 1960. Suspicious actions, abrupt departure from employment, possession of a vehicle matching the Cooper case description, relocation to another state immediately following the disappearance. The report was submitted to the director of the Ohio Cold Case Unit that same day. After reviewing it, he signed the upper right corner with the directive, "Proceed with verification of subject Flynn's identity and associated assets, collect additional evidence from hospital and motor vehicle records. Priority, investigate the green Chevrolet vehicle." Marcy secured the original report in a red evidence binder and added to her working log, "Review complete. Margaret Flynn identified as primary suspect, vehicle associated with the case, Chevrolet Bel Air green license plate 023X57. As she left the briefing room, she paused before a display board holding the photograph of 3-year-old Charlotte Cooper and the image of 58-year-old Rose Flynn. Under the yellow light, the two faces seemed to merge, and Marcy understood that the search for the person who had taken 55 years of a child's life had now formally begun. After identifying Margaret Flynn as the primary suspect, the cold case unit began a detailed investigation of her background. Marcy contacted the Cincinnati Bureau of Vital Statistics, which maintained records from the 1950s, to retrieve personal data. The records showed that Margaret Elizabeth Flynn was born in 1930 in Dayton, Ohio, and married James Flynn, an electronics engineer, in 1953. 2 years later, James died in a highway accident on Interstate 71, leaving his 25-year-old widow. Associated medical records indicated that Margaret was hospitalized at Christ Hospital in 1956 for complications of a pregnancy, miscarriage at 8 months, followed by a note that she was infertile. This brief entry provided the first indication of a potential underlying motive. Further investigation revealed that Margaret had participated in a hospital-sponsored support group for women who had lost children, continuing until 1958. Treatment notes from her physician, Dr. Arthur Wells, recorded complicated grief with obsessive attachment to newborns, requiring long-term monitoring. His final entry in July 1960 described Margaret as having returned to a withdrawn state, frequently visiting the newborn nursery during shifts without assignment. When interviewed, a former colleague in her 80s told investigators Margaret loved babies. She could spend hours holding them, rocking them, wiping their faces as if they were her own. But sometimes she was strange, talking to herself, whispering names we didn't recognize. Marcy recorded the statement in the case file. Records also showed Margaret had been reprimanded twice for taking newborns from the nursery without authorization to walk them to sleep. No serious incidents occurred, so the hospital issued only internal warnings. A review of administrative records found no criminal history for Margaret Flynn. She had a clean legal record and filed taxes regularly until her departure. However, the psychological timeline suggested she had entered a state of disorder following the trauma of her miscarriage. From 1957 to 1959, she was prescribed mild sedatives and saw Dr. Wells monthly. A 1959 letter from Wells to personnel management stated, "Patient Flynn presents no risk of harm, but requires supervision during prolonged contact with infants. Psychological compensatory tendencies could lead to uncontrolled behavior." The letter remained internal and was forgotten after Wells left Christ Hospital the following year. Another retired nurse, Nora Hastings, recalled that in the weeks before Margaret disappeared, she began collecting photographs of children from magazines, keeping them in her locker, and saying, "One day, I will be a mother like everyone else." Hastings added, on October 10th, she left the hospital earlier than usual, saying she was going to buy a gift for the little one. "I thought she was adopting a child." These accounts left the cold case briefing room in silence. Marcy took detailed notes, her grip tight on her pen, as the psychological pieces began to align. Margaret Flynn was not a typical criminal. She was a woman bearing deep wounds from loss and isolation, but that very emptiness may have driven her across the boundary between love and possession. Examination of hospital security records uncovered a 1960 internal report. Nurse M. Flynn observed taking an official Chevrolet vehicle without authorization on October 12th and returning it late. No disciplinary action taken as vehicle was returned. However, this entry was struck through, with a marginal note in different handwriting, "Not returned." Marcy reviewed the document repeatedly, recognizing it as the final direct link between Margaret and the green vehicle. In the summary report to superiors, she wrote, "Subject Flynn, female, 30 years old, widowed, infertile, treated for psychological issues following miscarriage, exhibited obsessive attachment to newborns, and received internal warnings. Medical records indicate severe emotional disorder leading to deviant behavior. No criminal record, likely motive, replacement of lost child." As Marcy typed the final lines, night had fallen outside. Wind rattled the thin blinds, and a stack of yellowed files lay spread across her desk. Among the pages, a black and white photograph of Margaret Flynn in her nurse's uniform, smiling faintly but with distant eyes, served as a quiet reminder that gentleness can sometimes conceal an unsuspected abyss. Once the files on Margaret Flynn's background and behavior were complete, the cold case unit proceeded to the next phase, recovering physical evidence from her former residence in Indiana. Property tax and ownership records identified a small wooden house on Maplewood Road in a Fort Wayne suburb. held by Margaret from 1962 until her death in 2010. The house now stood vacant, managed by a local bank after Rose Flynn, the legal heir, relocated. On November 4, 2015, a joint Ohio-Indiana investigative team arrived at the address with a search warrant issued by an Indiana court. In the misty morning, the house stood silent amid leafless maples, its wooden door peeling and its steps covered in moss. Marcy ascended the porch, removed the old seal, and opened the rusted lock. The interior air was thick with damp and dust, which coated the tables and bookshelves. The walls held numerous faded photograph frames, mostly images of children, boys, girls, and several clearly clipped from magazines. Some were actual photographs on aged paper, including one labeled in adult handwriting, Rose, 1962. On the mantel was a small leather-bound journal, its spine crumbling and clasp corroded. Marcy carefully opened it to reveal pages of neat handwriting, signed M.F., containing brief entries spanning 1959 to 1965. The first entry read, "I hear crying in my head, faint as a breath, and it will not stop." Subsequent pages mixed conflicting emotions, love, remorse, fear. Midway through, an entry dated October 13, 1960 stated, "It was cold today. The little girl slept in my arms. She did not cry, only looked at me. I named her Rose, for the color of the flowers on the hospital room table." Marcy sat motionless for several seconds, then placed the journal in a sealed evidence bag, using nylon gloves. Continuing through an old desk, she found a large envelope containing property deeds, nursing licenses, and an aged photocopy of a birth certificate. State of Kentucky, birth certificate. Name Rose Flynn, date of birth, March 12, 1957. This document differed markedly from the electronic version Marcy had previously examined. It bore an embossed Christ Hospital seal, not a Kentucky facility, and the signature in the doctor-attendant field was a Wells, matching the name on a document Marcy had suspected of being forged. She immediately sealed the certificate, noting suspected fraudulent birth certificate, links to Christ Hospital. While forensic technicians searched the attic, they located a dust-covered wooden trunk, secured with a rusted lock. After forcing the lock, they found dozens of photographs of young children, most taken in a hospital setting, newborns, white bassinets, medical rooms. Several bore handwritten notations on the reverse, summer 1960, maternity ward. One photograph stopped the team entirely, a 3-year-old girl with curly hair, wearing a plaid dress, standing by a low fence. The edge of the image read, "Rose, new home." Marcy carefully placed the photograph beside the known 1960 image of Charlotte Cooper. The faces were nearly identical. Beside the trunk was a small tin box containing unsent postcards and letters. One letter, dated October 14, 1960, unsealed and unstamped, was written in hurried script. "I did what I had to do. The child needed a mother, and I needed a reason to go on. Forgive me if anyone is hurt." It was unsigned, except for M. Marcy read it slowly, a chill running down her spine. All documents, photographs, and the journal were sealed into 3 evidence packages, numbered V01 through V03. She prepared a detailed inventory, specifying contents and chain of custody protocols, and ordered comprehensive photographic documentation of the scene. As the forensic team packed the materials, Marcy made a final inspection of the rooms. On the dining table sat a glass jar containing dried flowers, and a tablecloth embroidered with the letter R was neatly folded. Small details underscoring Margaret's enduring fixation on the name she had chosen. As they exited the house, Marcy stood on the porch, watching the fading sunlight filter through dust-covered windows, her silhouette blending into the still scene. Inside, the evidence lay secured, fragments of time preserved, and finally exhumed after more than half a century. As the forensic vehicles departed, Marcy opened her notebook and entered the day's final entry. Evidence recovery successful. Journal, child photographs, fraudulent birth certificate. all consistent with victim Charlotte Cooper data. The residence preserves the entirety of a parallel existence in which a woman sought to mother a child that was not hers. After all physical evidence from Margaret Flynn's former residence had been seized and examined, the cold case team convened a comprehensive analytical meeting to determine the true motive behind the kidnapping of Charlotte Cooper. Forensic experts, criminal psychologists, and representatives from the Ohio State Prosecutor's Office were in attendance. Projected on a large screen were enlarged images of diary pages, photographs, and an unsent letter, with every detail magnified. Marcy presented a summary of the chain of evidence. Margaret, a widow who was infertile and had suffered a miscarriage, exhibited prolonged emotional dysregulation and loss of behavioral control when interacting with children. She subsequently left the hospital and disappeared with a child that matched the timing of Charlotte's abduction. There were no signs of ransom demands, financial connections, or extortion letters. Financial analysis revealed that Margaret had no monetary difficulties. She maintained a stable savings account and had never taken out loans. When an investigator asked the psychological expert, Dr. Laura Jensen, she opened a thick file and explained, "This behavior is characteristic of emotional substitution syndrome. Following the loss of a fetus, the individual experiences a disruption in reality, testing, and develops the belief that she can still become a mother by rescuing or reclaiming another child. This is not intentional violent behavior, but a psychological mechanism intended to fill an emotional void." She pointed to a diary entry that read, "I named her Rose, after the flowers on the hospital table, and analyzed it." The writer did not believe she was committing a crime. In her mind, the child was her biological offspring, returned to its rightful mother. There was no material motive or intent to cause harm. Her words left the room in silence. One investigator asked, "Then why did she choose Charlotte rather than a newborn from the hospital?" Laura replied, "Because Charlotte represented what Margaret had lost, a child who had survived the fragile early stages. Unable to bear her own child, she observed hundreds of others in her role as an obstetric nurse. Charlotte was the perfect embodiment of the child she had lost, but who had lived." Marcy turned to a document and read from the final unsent letter, "The child needed a mother, and I needed a reason to go on." According to Laura, this clearly illustrated a reverse state of perception in which the kidnapper viewed her actions as redemptive rather than criminal. The psychological report was finalized within 2 days. In its conclusion, Laura wrote, "Motive for the kidnapping: replacement of the lost child. The behavior was carried out in a state of distorted but organized perception. There were no elements of profit-seeking or post-kidnapping violence. Classification: emotional abduction, kidnapping driven by emotional needs, not financial gain." Accompanying the report was an analysis from the Federal Behavioral Institute, which confirmed that similar cases typically involve women who have suffered miscarriages, experienced social isolation, and had direct occupational contact with children. Recidivism rates are low, as the behavior is primarily aimed at reconstructing an imagined family rather than achieving material benefit. When the conclusion was announced, the representative from the prosecutor's office nodded in agreement. There is no evidence of coercion or concealment of assets. Miss Flynn did not flee from the law, but lived openly for 50 years under the identity of the child's mother. All evidence indicates this was a kidnapping motivated by emotional factors. The room remained silent for a long time, after which the cold case director formally declared, "Case #412. Cooper is classified as emotional kidnapping. No profit motive." Marcy sat quietly, looking at the image of Margaret Flynn on the screen. The face of the woman from half a century earlier, gentle and distant. She recalled the old house in Fort Wayne, with children's photographs covering the walls, and the words, "I hear crying in my head." These were no longer merely clues in a cold case, but the painful traces of a mother broken by loss. When the meeting minutes were completed, she added a final line to her notebook. Motive established: replacement of the lost child. Behavior lacked intentional violence or profit-seeking. Expert conclusion: emotional abduction. At the corner of the table, lamplight fell on two photographs placed side by side. Charlotte at 3 years old, and Margaret in her nurse's uniform, two lives bound together by one woman's isolation and the other's half-century silence. 3 weeks after the psychological analysis was completed, the cold case team finalized a comprehensive report for submission to the Ohio Department of Justice to formally confirm the investigative findings. The final meeting took place in a small conference room at the Columbus headquarters, where all data, timelines, movement maps, physical evidence, DNA results, and the psychological report were presented on a large screen. Marcy was the primary presenter. Her voice was steady and deliberate. Based on the totality of evidence, including DNA analysis, administrative documents, physical evidence from the suspect's residence, and in-depth psychological evaluation, we have determined that Margaret Elizabeth Flynn abducted Charlotte Cooper on October 12, 1960, in Springdale, Ohio. The victim was raised under the alias Rose Flynn and resided in Indiana thereafter. The screen displayed a timeline linking key events: 1956, miscarriage; 1958, return to work at Christ Hospital; 1960, abduction; 1961, false birth certificate in Kentucky; 1962, settlement in Indiana; 2015, DNA confirmation. Each step was substantiated by specific records and physical evidence. The cold case director summarized, "We have a complete, consistent chain of behavioral, psychological, and scientific evidence. There is no doubt regarding the victim's identity." The report, nearly 100 pages long and coded Case #412, final review, began with a detailed chronology, followed by legal and behavioral conclusions, and concluded with administrative recommendations. The preliminary conclusion was stated unequivocally: Margaret E. Flynn, a nurse at Christ Hospital, abducted Charlotte Cooper on October 12, 1960. The act was not motivated by ransom, but stemmed from psychological disturbance following a miscarriage. The victim was raised as Rose Flynn, sustained no physical injuries, and remains alive in Indiana. The report included a DNA summary confirming a 99.8% match between Rose Flynn's blood sample and the genetic reference from her biological father, William Cooper. The final line of the forensic conclusion read, "Direct paternal filial genetic relationship confirmed. Statistical margin of error is not possible." As this passage was read, no one in the room maintained a detached professional demeanor. After more than half a century, a disappearance once declared unsolved had been resolved. Marcy took a deep breath and looked around the room, where many of her colleagues had moist eyes. The legal division director stated, "With these results, the Department of Justice will approve the investigative conclusion and close the file in resolved. Victim alive status." He paused, looking at Marcy. "You and your team have accomplished what an entire previous generation could not." Outside the glass doors, the season's first snow began to fall lightly. Dusting the parking lot with a thin white layer, Marcy watched the snowflakes, thinking of the Springdale house, its low fence, and the yard where 3-year-old Charlotte had vanished. She felt everything closing in the simplest way possible: no suspect left to pursue, no truths left concealed. Only the final answer to a question that had lingered for more than half a century. At the conclusion of the meeting, the official summary was signed by representatives of the Ohio Department of Justice, the cold case director, and the chief forensic examiner. The original was archived in state records, with copies forwarded to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office. In the final notation of the report, Marcy added a handwritten line: "Charlotte Cooper, missing 1960, located 2015. Margaret Flynn, both the bearer of guilt and the preserver of the child's life. Preliminary conclusion: emotional abduction, non-profit motive." As the others left the room, she remained a few minutes longer, organizing the documents. Her gaze settled on a framed photograph of Lieutenant Frank Dillard from 1960. He had been the first to insist it was a kidnapping, and now, half a century later, that conviction had been proven. Marcy placed a copy of the report beside the photograph and said quietly, "You were right." Then she turned off the lights, closed the conference room door, and carried the Cooper file, stamped in red with the final resolution, out of the room, a truth that had waited 55 years to be articulated. On the morning of December 2, 2015, nearly 2 months after the Cooper case file had been reopened, the state of Ohio held an official press conference at the Department of Justice headquarters in Columbus. The large briefing room was filled with reporters, television cameras, and national media outlets. Behind the head table, a backdrop displayed the Ohio State Seal and the words "State of Ohio Department of Justice, Official Statement on Case #412. Marcy sat in the second row, holding the case file and watching the officials prepare to take the podium. At precisely 9 a.m., Department of Justice spokesperson Eleanor Briggs appeared with the State Bureau of Investigation Director and the cold case team leader. Camera flashes illuminated the room as Briggs began. 55 years after the disappearance of 3-year-old Charlotte Cooper from Springdale, the state of Ohio has officially confirmed that the victim is alive. She was located in Indiana, where she has lived for decades under the identity of Rose Flynn. The room fell silent for several seconds, then erupted in murmurs. Briggs continued. DNA testing has confirmed a direct biological relationship with William Cooper, now 86 years old. An investigation spanning several months has concluded that this was a case of emotional abduction, not motivated by financial gain. The suspect, Nurse Margaret Flynn, died in 2010. Reporters raised their hands with rapid-fire questions. Does the victim know who she is? Has she agreed to meet her biological family? Why was the case dormant for so long? Briggs maintained a calm tone, reading from the prepared statement. The victim's identity was established through modern mitochondrial DNA analysis. Miss Flynn fully cooperated during the investigation. Due to the sensitive nature of the case, her current identity and image, as well as those of her family, will remain protected under witness protection protocols. Marcy observed the young reporters, whispering in a mix of astonishment and emotion. On the large screen behind the podium, 2 images were displayed: Charlotte Cooper, at 3 years old in 1960, accompanied by the words, "Found alive, 2015. No current photograph appeared below, only a brief note, per the subject's request, personal images are withheld. When the State Bureau of Investigation Director spoke, he acknowledged those involved in the original case. We wish to express gratitude to Lieutenant Frank Dillard, the first investigator on the case in 1960. His report notation regarding a medical vehicle provided the foundation for solving it today, and to the cold case team, particularly Lieutenant Marcy Quinn, who reopened the file from a single hair sample. Applause followed, but Marcy only lowered her head, her throat tight. For a moment, she thought of the elderly man in the nursing home, who had spent a lifetime searching for his daughter. The press conference concluded with a brief statement. Case #412, Cooper is classified as resolved, with the file officially closed after 55 years. The state will coordinate with social services to provide psychological support and protect the privacy rights of all parties involved. Outside the building, hundreds of journalists continued to arrive, cameras trained on every exit, in hopes of capturing an image of the woman dubbed Ohio's lost child. Yet no one knew that, at that moment, in a quiet nursing facility, 40 miles from Columbus, William Cooper sat in an old wooden chair, with a photograph of his late wife Helen, and a newly arrived letter on the table before him. The return address read, Rose Flynn, Fort Wayne, Indiana. The letter contained only a few simple lines. I think I understand now. Thank you for never stopping believing that I was still out there. A state social worker visited, instructing him to avoid all media contact and ensuring that any communication would be channeled through legal representatives. The Witness Protection Unit collaborated with Indiana Police to develop a plan for discreet movement to safeguard privacy. In the Department of Justice offices, Marcy signed the final version of the public report, headlined in bold, Charlotte Cooper found alive, case closed. She stared at those words for a long time, knowing that to the public, it was a miraculous story, but to those involved, it was merely the quiet closing of a half-century of waiting. Outside, the season's first snow fell lightly on the press vehicles, and amid the flashing lights, the name Charlotte Cooper was spoken for the first time in 55 years, without the word missing. Following the press conference, the Ohio Department of Justice and Witness Protection Authorities began preparations for a private meeting between William Cooper and the woman formerly known as Rose Flynn. All arrangements were kept strictly confidential, with only 3 cold case team members aware of the time and location. The meeting was scheduled for the morning of December 15, 2015, at the suburban nursing facility where William resided. Marcy personally oversaw the entire process to ensure no media or outsiders gained access. Prior to the meeting, social services psychologists evaluated the emotional states of both parties. Their report indicated that William, though frail, remained mentally sharp, with detailed and coherent memories of his daughter. Charlotte, the woman's true name, expressed confusion and apprehension, but a willingness to meet the man who waited for me my entire life. That morning, the sky was overcast, with light snow falling on the rooftops. The meeting room was simply furnished with a round table, 2 chairs, and a large window overlooking a winter garden. William was already seated, wearing a brown sweater, his hands trembling slightly on the tabletop. When the door opened, Marcy entered first, followed by Charlotte, a woman with gray-streaked blonde hair and gray eyes identical to those in the 1960 photograph. No one spoke for several seconds. Charlotte paused a few steps from him, clutching a handkerchief tightly. William looked up, his aged eyes brimming with tears. In a quiet, trembling but clear voice, he said, "Are you Charlotte?" She nodded, tears falling unchecked. He extended a thin, shaking hand, and she stepped forward to take it. In that moment, time seemed to stop. The distance between a father who had lost his daughter and a daughter who had never known her identity vanished, replaced by the quiet warmth of 2 trembling hands clasped after more than half a century of waiting. Marcy stood back, silently observing the profound stillness that enveloped the room. After a few minutes, Charlotte withdrew an old photograph from her pocket. The picture found in Margaret Flynn's house, showing the 3-year-old girl by the fence. "I kept it from when I was little, though I never knew why." William looked at the image, his lips quivering. "Your mother took that picture." They wept together without sound. Their conversation lasted more than an hour, in the presence of a social worker and psychologist. Charlotte described a peaceful childhood, raised in the care of the woman she had called mother. Margaret Flynn had never spoken of the past, but had taught her how to care for others and live kindly. "I don't hate her," Charlotte said slowly. "She was also a victim of loneliness." William nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I don't want you to hate anyone. I only wanted you to know your mother loved you so much." She responded with a gentle embrace, an act of forgiveness for all that had transpired. Afterward, the psychologist concluded, there were no signs of shock or post-traumatic disturbance. Both parties demonstrated natural acceptance and bonding. Formal identification procedures were completed with a certified parent-child DNA confirmation, signed on December 16, 2015, and notarized by the Department of Justice. In the file, the final entry read, "Charlotte Cooper, identity restored, status, alive." As the others left the room, Marcy was the last to remain. Looking out the window, she saw William and Charlotte seated together on wooden chairs on the covered porch, snow dusting their hair. He was pointing into the distance at the line of trees along the entrance drive, while she smiled and nodded, as if hearing stories of an old garden in Springdale, where she had once played as a 3-year-old. Marcy knew this moment would never appear on television, would carry no sensational headlines, only this small, serene scene of a father and daughter, finally reunited, after 55 years apart. As she left the facility, snow continued to fall softly, blurring the road, and in the car window's reflection, The images of the two remained visible, two lives rejoined in the gentle silence of an Ohio winter. After the reunion, with all legal and psychological protocols completed, Marcy believed the Cooper case could finally be closed. However, while reviewing archived files in preparation for transferring them to the National Archives, she noticed an anomaly in the original DNA examination report. In the technical notes from the Ohio State Forensic Laboratory, alongside the mitochondrial DNA match between Charlotte and William Cooper, there was a small entry marked a DNA trace male, unidentified. The handwritten notation appeared in the margin and was absent from the public report. Marcy frowned and contacted Dr. David Hale for clarification. He confirmed that a secondary male DNA trace had been detected in the 1960 sealed fabric sample but had not been pursued further at the time, as the primary objective was victim identification. "I considered it possible contamination," he said. "But if you wish, I can re-examine it." Instinct compelled Marcy not to dismiss it. She immediately requested that the original samples be retrieved from the forensic vault and returned to the Worthington Analysis Laboratory, where the investigation had begun months earlier. Under bright white lights, the two original sealed envelopes were placed on a steel tray. Men 1, hair, Men 2, fabric. The fabric sample, collected from the back porch of the Cooper residence near the wooden door, where Margaret Flynn may have handled the child, was carefully sectioned, and a small portion was loaded into an extraction machine. Several hours later, the results displayed a clear residual male DNA profile, distinct from that of William Cooper or any family reference samples. The profile's purity indicated direct contact, likely from someone who had handled or worn the fabric, rather than environmental contamination. Hale looked up, his expression grave. Someone else was present with Margaret Flynn at the scene. Marcy documented the finding and requested a comparison of this trace profile against the Ohio State Crime Database, which yielded no matches in over half a century of offender records. She then turned to an internal investigation of Christ Hospital personnel, focusing on male staff who had worked with Margaret during the relevant period. From the 1960 personnel roster, she identified 7 physicians and 2 technicians assigned to the obstetrics ward. Only one name appeared indirectly in prior documents: Dr. Arthur Wells, an obstetrician who had provided psychological treatment to Margaret following her miscarriage. Marcy recalled the name from the false birth certificate for Rose Flynn, where the doctor-attendant field was signed A. Wells. Reviewing medical records confirmed that Wells had resigned from Christ Hospital at the end of 1960, coinciding with Margaret's departure. The stated reason was relocation to the South. National licensing records showed him briefly registered at a small hospital in Kentucky in 1961, after which he disappeared from professional documentation. A tax record indicated he had died in 1975 in Tennessee. Marcy exhaled, recognizing that direct testimony was impossible, but the newly identified secondary DNA trace raised the possibility that Margaret had not acted alone. She reported the preliminary results to the cold case director, proposing that Wells may have assisted with falsifying the birth certificate and possibly participated in the abduction itself. If he signed the birth certificate, it is highly probable that his DNA would be present on the fabric, she said. The director authorized cross-verification with surviving medical records from Christ Hospital that might contain reference samples from Wells. The following day, investigators accessed the hospital's archival storage. In a 1958 obstetrics departmental file, labeled Staff File, Dr. Arthur L. Wells, they located several employee blood test samples retained for medical risk management. Wells's sample, sealed with an intact label reading Specimen 1959, blood type O+, remained preserved. Marcy requested its immediate transport to the State Forensic Laboratory. Outside, darkness had fallen, and snow blanketed the hospital walkways. As she returned to her vehicle, a chill ran down her spine, the sensation of uncovering a shadow in what had seemed a fully resolved case. In her mind, the pieces aligned: the isolated woman, the green Chevrolet, the unsent letter, and now another figure. Dr. Wells, her treating physician, potentially the only other person who knew the full truth of how Charlotte left Springdale that day. She wrote in her case log, "Secondary male DNA trace, identified in 1960 evidence sample, hypothesis, accomplice, Dr. Arthur Wells, Christ Hospital. Verification requested via 1959 blood sample. Comparative results will confirm or refute the presence of a second individual in the abduction." When the archived blood sample from Dr. Arthur Wells was transferred to the Ohio State Forensic Laboratory, Marcy immediately requested parallel analysis against the secondary DNA trace recovered from the Cooper scene fabric. Preliminary results showed more than a 70% genetic sequence match, a sufficiently high correlation to establish biological linkage, particularly given the age of the samples. Dr. Hale confirmed, "The probability of random coincidence is less than 1 in a million. The secondary DNA trace almost certainly belongs to Dr. Arthur Wells." The statement cast a heavy silence over the cold case conference room. The name of Wells, previously mentioned only peripherally as Margaret's treating physician, now emerged as that of a long-overlooked accomplice. Marcy reopened Christ Hospital personnel records. Wells was born in 1926, trained in medicine at the University of Louisville in Kentucky, and transferred to Cincinnati in 1955, where he worked in obstetrics and later as a resident physician. His employment record noted resignation, October 1960, reason relocation, precisely coinciding with Margaret's departure from the hospital. An archived letter from a colleague described Wells as reserved, discreet, and close with Nurse Flynn. They frequently worked overlapping night shifts and collaborated on a research project concerning postpartum psychological health. Vital records showed Wells had married in 1958, but separated after 2 years, with no children or close surviving relatives. After leaving Christ Hospital, he appeared briefly in Kentucky licensing records before vanishing from administrative documentation. His final tax record listed an address in Tennessee, where he died in 1975 from a cardiac event and was buried in a family plot at a Nashville cemetery. Marcy traced these connections, perceiving an increasingly clear link between the two individuals. What began as a professional relationship culminated in their simultaneous departure from employment, joint appearance in the falsified birth certificate for Rose Flynn, and now shared DNA traces at the crime scene. In a preliminary memorandum, she wrote, "Hypothesis of second accomplice, Dr. Arthur L. Wells, resident physician at Christ Hospital, participated in falsifying the birth certificate and was present at the kidnapping scene. However, for the evidence to hold legal weight, independent verification of Wells's DNA was required." She contacted Tennessee administrative offices, confirming his burial site at Mount Olivet Cemetery under the name Dr. Arthur L. Wells, 1926-1975. Forensic experts recommended exhumation to obtain a skeletal sample for comparison with the secondary trace. Marcy submitted a formal proposal to the cold case director and state prosecutor's office. The approval meeting lasted more than 2 hours, with representatives from the Judiciary and Federal Department of Justice present. Some objected that the case was too old to justify an exhumation order, but Marcy presented 2 key points. First, the case qualified as an expanded federal matter with a potential unidentified accomplice. Second, DNA verification was not intended to prosecute a deceased individual, but to complete the historical record and clarify the roles of all parties involved. Ultimately, the panel approved the request, stipulating strict forensic oversight and the presence of local authorities. The exhumation order was signed on January 9, 2016. The following morning, Marcy joined forensic technicians and Tennessee law enforcement at Mount Olivet Cemetery. Light rain fell amid thick fog, and cold rose from the damp earth. A modest granite headstone bore the simple inscription, "Arthur L. Wells, 1926-1975. Workers excavated nearly 2 meters before the coffin lid was raised, releasing the scent of decayed wood and old soil. Forensic specialists carefully extracted samples of sternal bone and molars for DNA analysis, placing them in refrigerated, sealed containers in the presence of the Davidson County Sheriff. Marcy stood a short distance away, watching dark earth mingle with rainwater as it spilled over, feeling a profound unease. She experienced neither triumph nor fear, only the realization that she was reaching the deepest layer of a case time had appeared to bury forever. As the team departed the cemetery, Hale messaged confirmation of sample receipt, with results expected within 10 days. That night, Marcy could not sleep. Sitting before her computer, she reviewed old photographs from the files. Wells, standing beside Margaret at the hospital's 1959 Christmas event, both smiling innocently, with no indication of the plan forming in secrecy. She wrote in her journal, "If the results match, it means the kidnapping was not solely the act of a desperate mother, but the product of a man who helped her cross the boundary between compassion and criminality." On the 10th day, the forensic laboratory reported completion of the analysis. Marcy opened the secure file transmission, her pulse quickening at the first line. DNA sample W1975 matches, secondary trace sample. 99.4% similarity. The technical conclusion followed. The secondary DNA profile recovered from the 1960 physical evidence matches the skeletal sample from Dr. Arthur L. Wells, confirming his presence at the Cooper abduction scene. She printed the report and placed it beside a photograph of the young Charlotte, saying quietly, "Now we know the whole story." In the quiet of the office, with only the sound of rain tapping the window frame and lamplight falling across the files, she added a new entry. Second suspect confirmed, Dr. Arthur L. Wells. The official analysis results from the Ohio State Forensic Laboratory were delivered to the Cold Case Unit on the morning of January 20, 2016. The results confirmed that the DNA sample extracted from the remains of Dr. Arthur Wells matched 99.4% with the secondary DNA profile obtained from a piece of cloth recovered from the crime scene in 1960, and with microbial traces found on the fibers of a preserved blanket stored with the original evidence. The replication of data across multiple genetic loci completely ruled out any possibility of error. Hale wrote in the report, "The referenced genetic sequence from the Wells remains indicates the direct presence of the individual at the site of the kidnapping or where the evidence was handled at the same time in 1960. This conclusion eliminated any remaining doubts about the existence of additional accomplices. Marcy held the nearly 100-page case file and read through it line by line. Every piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Margaret Flynn, the nurse who had lost a child and suffered from psychological distress. Arthur Wells, the treating physician who was the only person aware of her condition and had access to medical records and birth documentation. They had both worked the same shifts in October 1960. Both resigned almost simultaneously, and both disappeared from Cincinnati. A forged birth certificate bearing the signature Wells had been found in Margaret's old footlocker, and now Wells's DNA sequence had been identified on both the cloth and the blanket, where an adult's handprints had once held the child. All the evidence indicated that the kidnapping of Charlotte Cooper was the result of a deliberate plan facilitated and concealed by Wells. In the summary report, Marcy clearly stated, Dr. Arthur L. Wells is confirmed as an accomplice in the kidnapping of Charlotte Cooper. Role assisting in the preparation of forged documentation, providing medical certifications, and establishing the means for Margaret Flynn to remove the child from Ohio. Hospital administrative records showed that Wells had the authority to issue birth certificates and medical verification documents and was responsible for a team handling the transport of pediatric patients. In that capacity, he had access to blank forms and authentic seals, the critical elements that allowed the birth certificate for Rose Flynn to remain legally valid for half a century without detection. Marcy and the investigative team reviewed internal correspondence records and found a letter from Wells to the hospital's personnel director in October 1960, requesting resignation due to an urgent family matter requiring relocation to another state to care for a family member. The letter was signed Arthur and was written on the same type of paper and ink as documents found in Margaret's residence. Under ultraviolet light examination, the handwriting and pen pressure matched 96%, indicating they were written at the same time and likely in the same location. The Forensic Document Unit determined that Wells was not merely an accomplice in the act itself, but was involved in the entire process of concealment. The report was forwarded to the Ohio State Prosecutor's Office with a clear conclusion. The 1960 kidnapping of Charlotte Cooper involved at least 2 participants. Primary suspect, Margaret E. Flynn. Direct accomplice, Dr. Arthur L. Wells, resident physician at Christ Hospital, who assisted in creating a forged birth certificate, provided transportation means, and ensured the legal viability of the false identity. A copy of the report was stamped with confirmed co-conspirator identification and accompanied by supporting evidence, DNA results, handwriting samples, the birth certificate, physical evidence photographs, and personnel records. The Cold Case Unit Director signed off on the findings and authorized the creation of a supplementary accomplice file designated as File 412 Matters, E. Arthur L. Wells. In the electronic database, the Wells file was directly linked to the Cooper case, with the status line reading, Affiliation, Aiding Criminal Activity, Emotional Abduction. An internal meeting was subsequently held to announce the results. When the screen displayed 2 old photographs, Margaret in her nurse's uniform and Wells in a white coat, standing side by side in a hospital corridor in 1959. The room fell silent. Marcy stood and spoke deliberately. We have proven that this was not merely the desperate act of a woman who had lost a child, but a plan executed with the assistance of an individual with specialized knowledge of legal and medical systems. He created a new identity for the child and made the impossible legitimate. The Cold Case Director nodded, and for that reason, this case will be classified as solved. Historical co-offender in the state of Ohio, to fully document the entire chain of criminal involvement. Outside, a light rain fell, melting snow into rivulets running down the windows. In Marcy's hands was a newly printed file with a red cover, boldly labeled Co-Defendant Record, Dr. Arthur L. Wells, verified. At the bottom, she signed prepared by Lieutenant Marcy Quinn, Ohio State Cold Case Division, January 22, 2016. As she left the room, she paused before a large board displaying the list of solved cases, her hand resting lightly on the newly engraved metal line. Case hash 412, Cooper, Charlotte, solved. Directly below it was a smaller, recently added line, confirmed co-offender, Arthur L. Wells, Maryland. Everything had finally been clarified. It was no longer merely the story of a desperate mother, but a complete record of how 2 people who believed they were offering salvation had together created one of the longest kidnappings in American history. On January 28, 2016, the Ohio Cold Case Unit completed the final report for the Charlotte Cooper case, marking the conclusion of an investigation that had spanned more than half a century. The 127-page comprehensive report, bound in blue according to State Department of Justice standards, was titled Final Investigative Report, Case hash 412. The introduction stated in bold type, the official investigative conclusion, following the reopening of the case file in 2015, fully identifying the victim, primary perpetrator, and accomplice. Marcy was responsible for the final editing, meticulously reviewing every piece of data and evidence to ensure absolute accuracy before submission. The report was divided into 3 sections, a summary of the investigative timeline, forensic results, and legal conclusions. The first section detailed the full sequence of events from 1960, the abduction in Springdale, the initial errors by local police, decades of neglect, and the renewed investigation prompted by the case file digitization project. The second section compiled all physical and biological evidence, hair samples, cloth fragments, the forged birth certificate, diaries, handwritten correspondence, and DNA analysis, confirming that Charlotte Cooper, formerly known as Rose Flynn, was the victim abducted in 1960 and was still alive in Indiana. The third section, considered the core of the report, presented the legal conclusions. Margaret Elizabeth Flynn was the primary perpetrator, having committed child kidnapping, motivated by emotional compulsion rather than financial gain. The act occurred on October 12, 1960, in Springdale, Ohio. Arthur L. Wells was the accomplice, having facilitated the creation of a forged birth certificate, provided transportation, and ensured the legal validity of the false identity. Charlotte Cooper was the victim, still living, with her true identity legally confirmed under Ohio law. The report also addressed the legal responsibilities of involved institutions, Christ Hospital, where professional authority had been abused, to enable document forgery, and the Springdale Police Department, for failures in initial evidence preservation. However, due to the passage of time and the death of all involved parties, criminal prosecution was not possible. Instead, the case would be archived under the category Resolved Historical, Living Victim, and used as training material for cold case investigation courses. In the overall assessment section, the cold case director wrote, "The Cooper case exemplifies the importance of evidence preservation and the application of modern DNA technology in resolving files long buried by time. Although justice cannot be imposed upon the deceased, the truth has ultimately been established." Marcy reread that passage, her throat tightening. She added a brief personal note at the end. Charlotte Cooper, survivor of a 55-year kidnapping, with identity confirmed and reunion with biological father, William Cooper, on December 15, 2015. This is the longest-running cold case resolved in Ohio history. 4 copies of the report were printed, sealed, and distributed to the Ohio Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the National Archives. 1 copy was retained in the Columbus Cold Case Unit, secured in a specialized glass case alongside other significant historical files. That afternoon, Marcy personally placed the file in the second compartment beside other famous solved cases. As she closed and locked the cabinet, the soft click of the latch felt like shutting a door that had stood open for half a century. In the hallway outside, colleagues offered brief congratulations. The director shook her hand. "You have finished work that previous generations left incomplete," Marcy replied quietly. "I merely continued the path where they left off." As she turned to leave, winter sunlight streamed through the glass and fell upon the brass plaque on the conference room door. Case hash 412, Cooper, Charlotte, solved. Beneath that line were 3 smaller engraved names: Margaret Flynn, perpetrator; Arthur Wells, accomplice; Charlotte Cooper, survivor. She stood looking at it for a long time, then nodded, understanding that this final report was more than the closure of a single case. It was testimony to the human persistence in seeking truth, even if it took 55 years to reach it. When the final report was approved and publicly released by the Ohio Department of Justice, news outlets across the state simultaneously reported, "Charlotte Cooper case. Girl abducted in 1960, found alive, file officially closed after 55 years." Major newspapers, such as the Columbus Dispatch, Cleveland Plain Dealer, and the Cincinnati Enquirer, ran front-page stories with emotionally resonant, rather than sensational headlines. 1.5 century wait, Charlotte Cooper's belated justice. Public reaction was intense, blending astonishment and emotion. Forensic experts, academics, and ordinary citizens expressed admiration for the cold case unit, which had persistently followed leads long thought extinguished. 1 week later, the local television program Ohio Spotlight invited representatives from the investigative team to discuss the case, not naming the victim specifically, but framing it as a representative example of applying DNA technology and recovering archived files. Marcy appeared as the technical coordinator and stated succinctly, "We simply reopened pages that had not been fully read. Every case, no matter how old, deserves a conclusion." The remark quickly spread on social media and was widely quoted in articles on modern investigative practices. State authorities awarded a special commendation to the Columbus Cold Case Unit for outstanding achievement in resolving dormant case files and contributing to historical justice. At the award ceremony, the governor emphasized, "The Cooper case is not merely a story from the past. It is a reminder of the importance of patience, science, and faith in justice." Marcy accepted the commendation on behalf of the team, and when asked for her thoughts, she replied, "The credit belongs to those who began the investigation in 1960. They preserved every fragment of evidence so that we could continue." Public response extended beyond acclaim for the investigators. Online communities rallied in support of the victim, calling for expanded efforts in educating about child abduction prevention and evidence preservation. The Cooper Fund was established to provide financial support for long-term missing persons investigations. Charlotte Cooper, now using her birth name, agreed to collaborate with law enforcement on a national child safety awareness campaign. She did not appear publicly, but permitted the use of her account in educational videos and abduction prevention seminars. In a private interview with the investigative team, she said, "I cannot reclaim the years that were lost, but if my story prevents one father or mother from giving up, then it has meaning." The statement was quoted in a USA Today article, generating significant resonance. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children sent a letter of thanks to the Ohio state government for sharing Cooper case data with national training programs. Locally, schools in Springdale held a small memorial for Helen Cooper, the mother who had died without knowing her daughter was alive. A bronze plaque was erected outside the city library, inscribed "For all those who never stop searching." William Cooper, by then frail, was an honored guest at the dedication ceremony. He attended in a wheelchair, his vision dim but his eyes brightening as those around him spoke Charlotte's name. Marcy stood beside him, regarded as the bridge between generations of investigators. Criminal justice publications described the Cooper case as a gold standard in cold case resolution, comparable to other high-profile cases solved through DNA evidence. The Federal Bureau of Investigation subsequently requested its inclusion in national training programs on evidence preservation. More broadly, the Charlotte Cooper story reshaped public perceptions of belated truth, demonstrating that justice is not solely about apprehending perpetrators, but about recovering those who were lost. In Fort Wayne, where Charlotte had lived as Rose Flynn, former neighbors sent letters of support, expressing understanding and respect for her decision to remain private. She responded, "I do not seek fame. I only want other children to be spared the confusion in which I live." Recognizing the case's positive impact, the Ohio Department of Justice announced plans to expand funding for cold case projects, dubbing the initiative the Cooper Initiative in commemoration. When a reporter asked Marcy what had sustained her belief in a case long presumed dead, she smiled and replied, "Because someone still believed that child had never left this world." And somewhere in a nursing home, William Cooper sat silently before a framed photograph of his daughter, watching snow fall outside the window, knowing that in the end, not only he but the entire world had found Charlotte. Following the widespread publicity and significant impact of the Charlotte Cooper case in Ohio, the story rapidly spread nationwide, becoming a rare media phenomenon for a case resolved after more than half a century. Major networks such as CNN, NBC, and CBS News produced special segments titled "Justice Without a Statute of Limitations," using the Cooper case as the primary example of DNA science and human persistence in pursuing truth. Prestigious publications such as the New York Times and the Washington Post ran in-depth analytical articles exploring the social dimensions, the isolation of a desperate woman, the flaws in 1960s justice, and the tenacity of contemporary investigative work. On social media, the hashtag #CharlotteCooperCase amassed millions of shares, valued not for sensationalism, but for its human element, the unyielding faith of a father, and the determination of subsequent investigators. Public commentary hailed the Ohio Cold Case Unit as the night watchman of justice. Several documentary filmmakers proposed adapting the case, but the Ohio Department of Justice declined, emphasizing that its purpose was educational rather than commercial exploitation of tragedy. Instead, the state formally established the Cooper Initiative, a long-term funding mechanism for cold case investigations focused on evidence preservation, document digitization, and personnel training. At the initiative's launch press conference, the governor stated, "From a single strand of hair, we have unlocked the door to hundreds of other cases." The Cooper Initiative bears not only the name of one girl, but symbolizes the belief that every story deserves an ending. Marcy was invited to serve on the initiative's advisory board, overseeing investigative procedures and forensic protocols. She accepted on the condition that resources be prioritized for unresolved child abduction cases. That same year, the U.S. Department of Justice designated Ohio as one of 3 pilot states for the DNA Recovery Network program, facilitating interstate sharing of forensic data, beginning with the oldest case files. As a result, within 6 months of the Cooper resolution, more than 30 missing persons cases from the 1960s through 1980s were reopened nationwide, 2 of which were solved using comparable forensic techniques. The press termed this the Cooper effect, a positive chain reaction originating from a single case. In academia, criminal justice students studied the Cooper case as a case study in perpetrator psychology and professional ethics. A national conference on historical justice was held in Columbus, bringing together experts from 15 states to exchange practices. Marcy delivered the opening address, stating, "Science can decode data, but only human beings can keep the truth alive." The speech was reproduced in full in the American Law Review. Concurrently, Ohio launched an educational media campaign titled "Find Them All," inspired by the Cooper case, to raise awareness of the critical importance of preserving physical evidence in missing persons investigation. Each short documentary concluded with the line, "Justice has no expiration date. Preserve every trace." The slogan became emblematic of the Cooper Initiative and was emblazoned on the badges of the statewide cold case unit. In other jurisdictions, victims and families of the missing approached authorities in the hope that their own cases would be reconsidered. Hundreds of handwritten letters arrived at the Columbus cold case office, many beginning, "I read Charlotte's story, and I believe ours is not yet finished." Marcy and her team established a dedicated intake system to catalog and evaluate each submission without omission. By the end of 2016, a Department of Justice bulletin reported that more than 15 long-standing missing persons cases had undergone evidence file reconstruction, funded by the Cooper Initiative. The media described this period as the Winter of Resurrection. Faded black and white photographs were revived, forgotten names were invoked, and in every announcement, Charlotte Cooper's name stood as the starting point. In an editorial, veteran journalist Daniel Hargrove wrote, "Charlotte Cooper was not merely one person found. She is a reminder that justice, however delayed, can still redeem the past." Outside the Columbus Cold Case Division headquarters, a new metal plaque was erected, inscribed "Cooper Initiative for every missing voice." Marcy stood before it, her hand lightly touching the deeply incised letters in the cold steel, knowing that the case had transcended a single file. It had become the legacy of a generation committed to the belief that justice never sleeps. In March 2016, while compiling the database for the Cooper Initiative, an Ohio cold case analysis team uncovered new information related to Dr. Arthur Wells, the individual identified as an accomplice in the Charlotte Cooper kidnapping. While reviewing Wells's financial records and correspondence archived in Kentucky state repositories, the team discovered that he had contact with a private adoption agency called the Bluegrass Family Placement Agency in Louisville. Archival records from 1961 included a handwritten letter from Wells to the agency's director, referring to an infant in need of secure placement, and enclosing a photocopy of a birth certificate of indeterminate origin. The letter concluded with the signature Arthur L. Wells, Maryland, and a temporary contact address in Lexington, Kentucky. This discovery drew Marcy's attention because the timing aligned precisely with the period during which Wells and Margaret Flynn had vanished from Cincinnati. She immediately requested that Kentucky's Archival Division transfer all relevant Bluegrass Agency documents to the Ohio Cold Case Unit. Within days, hundreds of pages arrived, primarily records of adoptions processed between 1958 and 1962. Upon examination, the investigators identified a suspicious entry, an unidentified newborn designated infant #32, placed for adoption in May 1961 and referred by Dr. Wells. The accompanying birth certificate bore a forged hospital seal, identical to that used by Wells in creating the birth certificate for Rose Flynn. The infant was recorded as having been legally adopted by a couple from Georgia. However, the file was abruptly closed with no subsequent follow-up report, which violated regulations in effect at the time. When Marcy briefed the cold case director, the team concluded that this could represent a second instance of document falsification in Wells's pattern of behavior. They opened a separate investigative file designated case #415, Kentucky infant. In the case initiation memorandum, Marcy wrote, "Preliminary data indicates that Arthur L. Wells may have exploited his professional position to create and supply falsified adoption documentation. An infant was transferred out of Kentucky in 1961, with current identity unknown." Hypothesis: Wells continued document falsification activities following the Cooper kidnapping. The Ohio Department of Justice promptly requested formal investigative cooperation from Kentucky, forming a joint task force that included representatives from both states and child welfare agencies. Surviving documents from the Bluegrass Agency, many yellowed and faded, were subjected to analysis. Infrared scanning revealed recurring names, A. Wells and M. Flynn, appeared in two separate files. Latent fingerprints recovered from the margins of documents matched those of Margaret Flynn on file from Christ Hospital. Evidence indicated that both individuals had continued involvement in newborn medical processing for at least several months after leaving Cincinnati. From this data, Marcy reconstructed a hypothesis. After kidnapping Charlotte and relocating to Kentucky, Wells and Flynn had engaged with the adoption agency to legitimize documentation, not only for Charlotte, but potentially for at least one other child. Their movement pattern was extended to include a route from Kentucky to Georgia. All traces ceased at the end of 1961, when Wells severed ties with the agency. Federal investigators considered the possibility that Wells had established a small-scale network for producing falsified records, enabling private adoptions conducted outside official state channels. In a preliminary report to the Department of Justice, Marcy wrote, "These new findings indicate that Wells was not merely a passive accomplice in the Cooper case, but may have proactively extended a pattern of document falsification, leveraging his status as a physician to manipulate private adoption systems." The report included a recommendation to initiate a Level 2 federal investigation to determine the full scope of activity. In April 2016, the United States Department of Justice formally approved a comprehensive re-examination of all Kentucky adoption records from 1958 to 1962, with the Kentucky infant case designated as a priority. On Marcy's desk, beside the completed Cooper file, now sat a growing new volume labeled Case #415, Kentucky Infant. She regarded the label for a long time, recognizing that the door opened by the Cooper investigation had illuminated not only one story, but a trail of other secrets long interred by time. As evening fell, she added to her notebook, "Perhaps Wells did not stop with Charlotte, and perhaps Cooper was merely the beginning of a longer untold series." In May 2016, as the Kentucky infant files were just beginning to be processed, Marcy was tasked with preparing a comprehensive professional report summarizing the entire investigation of the Cooper case at the request of the Ohio State Department of Justice and the Cooper Initiative. The report, titled Post-Investigative Review, Case #412, was intended not only to archive operational data, but also to serve as a training resource for future investigators. She began with an assessment of the initial investigative errors in 1960, which had caused the case to languish for more than half a century. In her analysis, Marcy pointed out, the core errors did not stem from a lack of competence, but from systemic procedural deficiencies. Local police at the time had no established methods for preserving evidence, did not distinguish between crime scene traces and household items, and thus sealed the fabric sample containing DNA together with ancillary evidence. Second, the absence of coordination mechanisms between hospitals and police meant that data regarding service vehicles and medical personnel was not promptly examined. Lieutenant Dillard's report noted a suspicious medical vehicle, but without an electronic database, this information was never relayed to the state level. She also highlighted the subjective influence of public opinion and media, which directed suspicion toward the victim's family and diverted the investigation. In the context of 1960, a grieving mother was more readily regarded as a suspect than as a witness. Marcy cited Dillard's notes to illustrate his rare professional integrity, a man who trusted physical evidence when everyone else believed rumors. The second part of the report focused on the value of DNA technology in reviving old case files. Marcy detailed the process of extracting genetic material from hair samples stored for more than 50 years, a technical breakthrough considered the gold standard in cold case work. From a single strand of hair less than 3 centimeters long and a discolored piece of fabric, we were able to determine not only the victim's identity, but also identify an accomplice. This is clear evidence that long-term investment in evidence preservation pays off. A piece of evidence may lie dormant for decades, yet still hold the ultimate answers. She also proposed new protocols for the states. All physical evidence in child abduction cases must be double-sealed, biocoded, and stored in 2 independent locations. The report included comparative charts showing that, in 2015-2016 alone, the application of next-generation gene sequencing technology had increased the resolution rate of cold cases by 47%. She emphasized, DNA is not merely evidence, it is the biological memory of a crime. It exists independently of time, and when science advances sufficiently, it speaks for itself. The final section of the report analyzed the psychological impact on victim Charlotte Cooper, which Marcy described as the human element of every investigation. Drawing on records from the psychological support team involved in the reunification phase, she wrote, "Charlotte's case exemplifies the typical pattern of dual identity trauma, the psychological injury resulting from living with 2 conflicting identities. Discovering the truth brought not only joy, but also a resurgence of guilt and loss. However, with professional support, the victim can reconstruct a positive sense of self, embracing both halves of her life, Charlotte Cooper and Rose Flynn, as components of a unified memory." The report concluded that psychological support must be implemented concurrently with investigation, particularly in cold cases involving surviving victims. Marcy noted, "Forensic science can answer the question of who, but only therapy can address how they will live afterward." She further referenced William Cooper, the father who lived long enough to witness justice but not to escape the weight of decades of waiting. For family members, late-arriving justice does not erase the pain. It merely allows them to place the final period. Upon completion, the 48-page report was presented at a special meeting of the Cooper Initiative. State leaders deemed it a model document for national cold case training programs. Marcy closed the presentation, her gaze resting on the final line displayed on the screen. Case #412, Cooper from error to science, and ultimately to humanity. The room fell silent for several seconds before sustained applause rang out. For Marcy, this was not a reward but confirmation that their work, however cold and technical, ultimately stemmed from the singular, most enduring force, faith in the truth. In August 2016, following the approval of Marcy's professional report, the FBI, in collaboration with the Ohio Department of Justice, officially incorporated the Charlotte Cooper case into the National Investigative Training Curriculum. The case file, titled Reconstructing Cold Cases, the Cooper Method, marked the first time a state-level case had been adopted as a federal training standard. The materials were structured in 4 parts: evidence handling procedures, reinvestigation strategies, integration of DNA technology, and public communications management. The foreword featured a bolded quotation from the FBI director. "The Cooper case demonstrates that there is no statute of limitations on justice, only on belief." Marcy was invited to serve as a technical advisor for the program, responsible for presenting the case resolution as a sequence of operational steps. At the first training seminar in Quantico, she addressed more than 300 trainees, including investigators, forensic technicians, and data analysts, and displayed an old photograph of a ceramic mug from the Cooper family table, the smallest item in the evidence collection, once dismissed as insignificant but containing the pivotal strand of hair. She stated, "It all began with re-examining something that appeared to have no remaining value." The 8-hour session simulated the entire reinvestigation process. The first segment focused on evidence recovery. Marcy explained how mitochondrial DNA was separated from a 55-year-old hair sample using nano-sequencing technology, along with parallel sample storage protocols and methods for filtering environmental contaminants. "This is living proof that evidence preservation is not merely an administrative task, but an extension of justice itself," she stressed. The second segment, on behavioral investigation, was presented by an FBI psychologist using the Margaret Flynn profile. It outlined the rare pattern of emotional abduction, a type of kidnapping driven by psychological compulsion rather than material gain, and underscored the importance of recognizing mental disorders in cases lacking a financial motive. Had a behavioral analyst been involved in 1960, the case might not have faded into obscurity. The third segment addressed historical data management, employing the digitization system that Marcy and the Ohio cold case team had developed to convert thousands of paper files. It introduced a multi-layered retrieval model that links physical evidence data to the national DNA database in minutes. Reports showed that implementing this model reduced the average processing time for cold cases from 36 months to 9 months. Experts termed it the Cooper structure, a method of managing investigative data through logical linkages rather than chronological classification. The final segment covered media crisis management and victim support, prepared by the Ohio Department of Justice. The Cooper case served as an exemplary model for maintaining humanity in public communications, avoiding the release of victim images, preventing commercialization of the case, and emphasizing educational and policy value. The material stated explicitly, success is not only in solving the case, but in how the case is subsequently told, for remembrance and prevention. In addition to its inclusion in training, the FBI applied the Cooper model to the National Legacy Evidence Project, which permitted reanalysis of evidence from the 1940s through 1980s using modern DNA technology. Preliminary evaluations indicated that nearly 12% of dormant case files could regain evidentiary value through this approach. The FBI director stated at a press conference, "From a single strand of hair in Ohio, we have learned how to redefine the meaning of evidence." The Ohio Department of Justice also established the Cooper Training Lab in Columbus, where the entire investigative process is displayed as a learning model. Within that room, among glass cases containing evidence, a photograph of Lieutenant Frank Dillard is prominently placed beside a plaque bearing Marcy's words, "There are no cold cases, only traces that have yet to be heard." In early 2020, as the national DNA system under the Legacy Evidence Project became fully operational, the Federal Data Center notified Ohio authorities of a significant finding. During an automated review, the algorithm had identified 3 partial genetic matches to the DNA profile of Dr. Arthur Wells, the Cooper case accomplice, in 3 child abduction files from the 1950s and early 1960s in Kentucky, Georgia, and Missouri. Initial analysis indicated that these matches occurred in specific loci, consistent only with direct physical contact by Wells with the victim's evidence or medical records. The discovery prompted the Ohio Department of Justice to convene an emergency interagency meeting with the FBI and federal welfare authorities. Marcy, now a senior advisor to the Cooper Initiative, attended as an observer. As the analytical results appeared on a large screen, she felt a chill. The genetic sequences were identical to the microbial contamination pattern previously identified on the 1960 fabric sample. "He may have done more than simply assist Margaret Flynn," one investigator murmured. He may have participated in numerous other fraudulent adoption schemes. The panel unanimously approved a new federal investigation, designated Joint Case Wells Network Investigation, to determine the full scope of Wells's activities prior to his death in 1975. Although the Cooper case had been closed, Wells's shadow continued to extend across the modern forensic system, a reminder that each answer can lead to additional questions. In June 2020, the United States Department of Justice issued a statement. Federal authorities, in coordination with the states of Ohio, Kentucky, and Georgia, are launching an expanded investigation based on DNA matches to historical samples associated with the Cooper case. The objective is to identify instances of illegal adoptions between 1955 and 1962. Concurrently, Case #412, Cooper, Charlotte, was transferred to the Solved Historical Cold Case Archive with permanent storage status. The closing report, signed by Marcy, stated, "All behavioral, legal, and scientific elements have been conclusively resolved." The Cooper case concluded with restoration of the victim's identity, identification of the perpetrator and accomplice, and extension of its legal legacy. The original document was deposited in the National Archives in Washington, alongside other historically significant American cases. As she signed it, Marcy paused, recalling the early days, the dusty storage room, the hair sample in an old envelope, and the tremor of seeing the 99.8% match result. It had all become history, one closed chapter among thousands. Outside the Cold Case Unit headquarters in Columbus, a wall of honor displays dozens of black and white photographs of resolved cases. Among the gleaming metal plaques is a small bronze tablet inscribed, "Charlotte Cooper, 1957, and below it, in smaller lettering, "Found alive, December 2015. Each year, new trainees in the Cooper Training Lab are required to read the original case file before beginning their course. Marcy often stands silently in the background, listening as they quietly speak the name of the girl who had vanished from the world for more than half a century. In another part of Ohio, Charlotte, now in her 60s, lives quietly in a small house along the Maumee River. She rarely speaks of the past, but occasionally sends handwritten letters of thanks to the Cold Case Unit and the Ohio Department of Justice. In one letter to Marcy, she wrote, "Thank you for finding me, not to punish anyone, but to return my name to me." That fall, the Department of Justice released a summary report on the first year of the Legacy Evidence Project. 37 cold cases had been resolved, using improved DNA technology, with the Cooper case regarded as the foundational model for the entire system. On October 15, 2020, exactly 60 years after the abduction, the United States Attorney General formally designated the Cooper case a symbol of historical justice and entered it into the national record. As the announcement aired, Marcy sat in her office looking out over the grounds. The Ohio autumn sky clear and still, leaves falling gently as they had on the morning of her first visit to Springdale. On her desk lay the worn Cooper case file, its cover frayed at the edges, but inside remained her original note. "There are no cold cases, only truths that have yet to be heard." With those words, the 55-year journey of a minor abduction case from Ohio drew to a close, quietly, completely, yet leaving a lasting resonance in the history of American justice. The story of Charlotte Cooper is more than the resolution of a criminal case after 55 years. It is a mirror reflecting contemporary American society, a place where faith in justice, technology, and human persistence can still alter destinies. When Charlotte was found, what moved the nation was not merely the return of a long-lost child, but the manner in which a once-failed system rose to correct itself. The case demonstrates the value of preserving memory without the single strand of hair that Lieutenant Dillard sealed in 1960. Without the dedication of Lieutenant Marcy Quinn in meticulously reviewing dusty old files, that truth might have been lost forever. In a modern American society, where information moves too swiftly and the past is easily forgotten, this lesson underscores the need to respect detail, to persist in pursuit of truth, and to never disregard the small things. Moreover, The Cooper case evokes a sense of humanity in the administration of justice. Charlotte was not turned into headline news or a tragic symbol. Her identity was protected, and she was treated as a person. In a country where powerful media can blur the line between justice and spectacle, this serves as a reminder that true justice involves not only identifying perpetrators, but also healing those who have been harmed. Finally, the existence of the Cooper Initiative illustrates the importance of science and federal collaboration, that DNA technology, data management, and human patience can together restore equity, even after half a century. In contemporary life, the lesson of the Charlotte Cooper case calls on us to trust in the power of truth, however belatedly it arrives, for justice, like humanity itself, exists only when someone continues to seek it. Thank you for joining us in the journey to rediscover the truth that had been forgotten for 55 years about Charlotte Cooper, a testament that justice never truly sleeps. Please subscribe to the channel so that you do not miss the subsequent stories, where the past and present converge in the pursuit of justice and compassion.